already spent 20 years working search and recovery in places most people avoid, even during daylight. Collapsed buildings after hurricanes, flood zones, backwoods disappearances, bodies pulled from rivers swollen thick with runoff and dead livestock. You develop a tolerance for ugly things, but there are still moments that stay inside you, moments your brain keeps replaying while you're brushing your teeth or sitting in traffic or trying to fall asleep beside the soft hum of an air conditioner. For me, it's the sound of somebody knocking on a cabin door from the middle of a flooded swamp at 2 in the morning. Not pounding, not frantic, just polite knocking, like they already knew we'd eventually let them in. This happened in southern Georgia, near the Occofinity, back in 2021. I was 46 then, divorced twice, bad lower back, drinking more bourbon than water most weeks. I'd started doing contract recovery work for county departments because apparently, if you spend enough years around death, local governments eventually decide you're qualified to go where other people refuse. The call came after 3 college students disappeared during a kayaking trip. Their abandoned vehicles were found near an old launch point outside Folkestone. Kayaks recovered downstream, no bodies. At first, everyone assumed drowning. Then, a game warden found one of the missing girls' backpacks hanging 30 feet high in a cypress tree. Still zip closed, mud smeared across it like wet handprints. That changed things. The county assembled a small recovery team since the swamp terrain was too unstable for larger operations. That's how I ended up there with Deputy Barlow and a local tracker named Ernest. Barlow was young, maybe 28, former Marine, trying too hard to look fearless all the time. Square jaw, buzz cut, mirrored sunglasses, even under cloud cover, because some men build entire personalities around never appearing uncertain. Ernest was the opposite, late 60s, thin as driftwood, weathered skin pulled tight across sharp cheekbones, white beard stained brown from tobacco. He moved slowly, but watched everything, especially the water. We met just before sunset, beside a rotting dock swallowed by reeds and black mud. The swamp stretched endlessly beyond it, dark water, twisted cypress trunks, hanging moss swaying gently despite no noticeable wind. The humid air smelled like wet bark, algae, dead fish, and something sour underneath it all. Rot, heavy rot. Mosquitoes swarmed thick enough to form clouds around our heads. Barlow slapped at his neck constantly. "How the hell do people live here?" he muttered. Ernest spat tobacco into the mud. "Swamp ain't for living." Then he glanced toward the tree line. "It's for taking." Good start. Exactly the kind of sentence you want to hear before willingly entering nightmare water. Humanity remains undefeated in terrible decision-making. We loaded gear into 2 small flatboats and pushed off just before dark. The swamp swallowed us quickly. Within 30 minutes, the world felt prehistoric. Narrow waterways wound through walls of dense reeds and towering cypress knees, jutting from black water like rotten teeth. Frogs croaked constantly somewhere beyond visibility. Insects screamed in endless waves through the trees. Occasionally, something large splashed nearby, never close enough to identify. The deeper we traveled, the stranger the swamp became. Dead birds hung tangled in branches. Fish floated belly up in stagnant patches of water. Several trees had deep grooves carved into their bark, nearly 7 feet high. Not claw marks, too deliberate, almost human. Barlow noticed them too. What made those? Ernest didn't answer immediately. Finally, something tall. That shut everybody up for a while. We reached the abandoned hunting camp around midnight. 3 cabins sat elevated above shallow water, connected by narrow wooden walkways barely wide enough for 1 person at a time. Rusted propane tanks leaned against one building. An old fan boat rested half-sunken nearby beneath layers of moss and algae. The place looked wrong immediately, not abandoned, naturally. Lanterns still hung from hooks. A tackle box sat open near the dock. 1 cabin door swung slowly back and forth with a soft creaking sound. Nobody spoke while unloading gear. Even Barlow had gone quiet. The silence around the camp felt unnatural. The insects had stopped. No frogs, no birds, nothing. Just distant water gently slapping against stilts beneath the cabins. Ernest stood motionless, listening to the darkness. Then quietly, "We shouldn't stay till morning." Barlow scoffed. "You scared of ghosts, old man?" Ernest turned toward him slowly. "No, I'm scared of things that learn." I remember the exact moment my stomach tightened hearing that. Because he sounded sincere, not theatrical, terrified. We split up briefly to search the cabins. I took the farthest one, alone. Inside smelled like mildew and old water damage. Rotting wood sagged beneath every step. The air felt strangely warm compared to outside, like something breathing. My flashlight swept across overturned furniture, mold-covered blankets, and muddy footprints tracked throughout the floor. Bare footprints, long and narrow. Human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too deep. Whatever made them was heavy. Then I noticed the photographs, dozens pinned along one wall, Polaroids mostly. Hunters posing with deer, families fishing, drunk men holding catfish beside lantern light. Except every photograph had one thing scratched violently into it. The eyes, every person's eyes carved out. I heard movement behind me, soft, wet, like somebody shifting barefoot on soaked wood. I spun around instantly, nothing there, but the hallway leading toward the back room stood open now. I was certain it had been closed before. Then came the voice. Help me. Female, weak, somewhere outside beyond the cabin. I stepped toward the doorway instinctively. Hello? The voice answered immediately. Please? Barlow suddenly shouted from outside, Dennis! The panic in his voice snapped me out of it instantly. I rushed back outside. Barlow stood frozen near the dock, pale as paper. What happened? He pointed silently toward the water. At first I saw nothing. Then the flashlight beam caught a face just above the surface, maybe 20 feet away. Human face, female. Pale skin floating motionless in black water. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted, long dark hair drifting beneath the surface. One of the missing girls. My chest tightened immediately. Jesus Christ. Then the face blinked, not dead, watching us. Barlow stepped forward. Ma'am? Ernest grabbed him violently. No. The girl's mouth slowly stretched wider. The jaw unhinged gradually until skin split near the corners. Then, in Barlow's exact voice, it said, Ma'am. Every muscle in my body locked instantly. The thing smiled and sank beneath the water. Barlow stumbled backward, whispering, What the fuck? That was when knocking started somewhere inside cabin 2. 3 soft knocks, then silence. 3 more. Barlow raised his pistol immediately. Someone's in there. Ernest looked genuinely panicked now. We leave. We can't leave if somebody's alive. Ernest turned toward him sharply. You think alive things knock like that? The knocking continued. Slow, rhythmic. Then came a voice from inside the cabin. A little boy, crying. Dad? Barlow froze. His face changed completely. What? Dad? The voice repeated softly. Barlow whispered, That's my son. I felt cold all over, instantly. Your son isn't here. The crying grew louder. Daddy. Barlow started toward the cabin automatically. Ernest physically blocked him. That ain't your boy. How would you know? Because your boy ain't been dead 6 years. Silence. Absolute silence. Barlow looked like somebody punched all the air from his lungs. Then the cabin door slowly opened inward by itself. Darkness waited inside, and standing there was a child-shaped silhouette. Small, thin, head tilted sideways, unnaturally. The voice came again. Daddy, Barlow broke. People like to imagine they'd react rationally in situations like that. They wouldn't. Grief destroys logic faster than fear ever could. Barlow shoved past Ernest and ran toward the cabin. Ethan! The silhouette moved instantly, not like a child, fast, violently fast. It burst from the darkness on all fours, long, pale limbs, water pouring from gray skin. Its face shifted constantly beneath stretched flesh, like multiple people trying to emerge at once. And the sounds. God, the sounds. Children crying, women screaming, men laughing, all coming from inside it, simultaneously. Barlow got one shot off before it hit him. The impact knocked both of them through the side railing into black water below. The screaming lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then only splashing remained. Then silence again. Ernest grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. We moved now. We ran across the walkways while the swamp erupted around us. Huge splashes. Movement through reeds. Branches shaking violently somewhere beyond the fog. And voices. Everywhere. Calling from darkness. Some begging. Some laughing. One sounded exactly like my ex-wife. Another sounded like my dead brother. Perfect imitations. Not distorted, not monstrous, but human. That was the worst part. The swamp itself seemed alive now. Fog rolled thick across the water, swallowing flashlight beams whole. Mud sucked at our boots near the docks. The air smelled overpoweringly rotten. Then the whistling started. low, aimless, coming from multiple directions at once. Ernest whispered, "Don't answer it." Something slammed against the underside of the walkway, hard enough to crack boards beneath us. I looked down briefly. Pale faces moved underwater below our feet. Human faces, eyes open, watching upward. One smiled. We reached the boat seconds before something emerged from the reeds behind us. Tall, at least 7 feet, its body looked assembled incorrectly. Limbs too long, spine bent oddly, skin slick gray beneath moonlight, and parts of it moved beneath the flesh. Faces, human faces pressing outward briefly before sinking back inside. One of them was Barlow, mouth open in silent screaming. I nearly vomited. The creature opened its mouth, and Barlow's voice came out perfectly. "Help me." Ernest started the engine. The creature took one step into shallow water, then another. It didn't hurry, like it knew distance no longer mattered. As we sped through narrow swamp channels, shapes moved beside the boats beneath black water, keeping pace. Sometimes hands surfaced briefly before slipping under again, sometimes faces, always smiling. Then the engine died. Of course it did, because horror stories and boat motors share a sacred blood oath, apparently. The swamp became silent instantly. No insects, no frogs, nothing. Then came soft knocking from beneath the hull. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Ernest closed his eyes. They followed. The knocking moved slowly along the bottom of the boat toward where I sat. Then directly beneath me, a child's voice whispered through the aluminum floor. "Daddy?" Even Ernest looked close to breaking then. The final thing I remember before the attack was seeing movement in the fog around us. Not one figure, several. Tall silhouettes standing motionless in waist-deep water, watching, waiting. The next morning they found me alone, wandering near Highway 121, covered in mud and blood, no sign of Ernest, no sign of Barlow. Officially, the report lists animal attacks and exposure-related delirium. But sometimes late at night, I still hear knocking beneath my apartment floor. 3 slow knocks, patient, polite, like something waiting underneath the building finally found me again. I used to think fear was loud, screaming, running, panic. That's what movies teach people. That terror announces itself dramatically, like it wants attention. Real fear is quieter than that. Real fear is sitting awake at 3 in the morning because your dog started growling at the dark corner of your bedroom again. Real fear is hearing water drip somewhere in your house when every faucet is turned off. Real fear is recognizing a voice you haven't heard in years coming from outside your window after midnight. And real fear is understanding, deep down, that something followed you home. This happened in the winter of 2019, about 8 months after my father died. I was 42 years old, living alone outside Mobile, Alabama, doing freelance repair work on shrimp boats and dock equipment, the kind of work that keeps your hands permanently smelling like gasoline and rust, no matter how hard you scrub them. My father had spent his entire life in the swamps. Commercial trapping mostly. Gators, nutria, wild hogs. He was one of those old southern men built entirely from silence and tobacco. Broad shoulders despite his age. Thick white beard, deep wrinkles cut into his forehead like dried riverbeds. Growing up, he used to tell me stories about certain places in the marsh you avoided after dark. Not because of animals, because some things in the water ain't got names. I always assumed it was old man superstition. Then he disappeared. Not officially. The state listed him as drowned after they found his boat drifting empty near the Tensas River Delta. But my father knew those waters better than most people know their own neighborhoods. He didn't just fall in. That's what bothered me. Then, 7 months after the funeral, I got a package. No return address. Inside was my father's old hunting knife. Mud still caked inside the grooves of the handle. Wrapped around it was a folded piece of stained paper with 6 words written shakily across it. "Don't go back to Stillwater Camp." That should have been enough. A sane person burns the note, throws the knife in a river, and continues living indoors where plumbing and electricity keep the monsters manageable. Instead, I drove 3 hours into the Delta because human beings are biologically incapable of leaving terrible ideas alone. I arrived just before dusk. The marina was nearly empty, except for one old man gutting fish beneath a flickering overhead light. He looked up when I mentioned Stillwater Camp. Everything about him changed, instantly. "You family of Roy Mercer?" he asked. That was my dad. The old man slowly set down his knife. He talked too much near the end. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, he pointed toward the swamp. "You hear whistling out there? Don't whistle back. Then he went back to gutting fish. That was apparently the final customer service interaction humanity had available that day. The swamp swallowed daylight fast once I launched the boat. Dark water stretched endlessly between towering cypress trees draped in hanging moss. Dense reeds crowded the narrow waterways. The air smelled like mud, algae, dead leaves, and stagnant water baking beneath old heat. Everything sweated, the trees, the boat, me, humidity wrapped around my body thick enough to feel physical. As darkness settled, insects erupted into deafening noise somewhere deep in the marsh. Frogs croaked from invisible patches of water. Occasionally, something huge splashed nearby without revealing itself. I kept thinking about my father, about the fact that he vanished out here, and about the note, "Don't go back to Stillwater Camp." The trip took nearly 2 hours. By the time I reached the old camp, fog had started rolling low across the water. The place looked dead. 3 cabins stood elevated above shallow marsh water on crooked stilts connected by warped wooden walkways. Rusted hooks swung from porch ceilings. Torn fishing nets hung motionless in the humid dark. One cabin leaned noticeably sideways, another had partially collapsed into the swamp. The third still had power somehow. A single yellow porch light glowed weakly through fog. That stopped me cold. Someone was there. I killed the engine and listened. Nothing. No voices, no movement, just distant insects screaming endlessly in the trees. Then came a soft sound from somewhere beneath the dock. Whistling, slow, aimless, like somebody standing in darkness, entertaining themselves. I remembered the old man instantly. "You hear whistling out there? Don't whistle back." The sound stopped abruptly. Then something bumped the underside of the boat, hard enough to rock it. I flashed my light over the side. Black water. Ripples, nothing else. I tied the boat to the dock and climbed onto the walkway carefully. The wood felt soft beneath my boots, swollen from years of moisture. The porch light flickered weakly overhead, and beneath it, nailed directly into the cabin wall, was my father's hat. The same faded camouflage cap he wore every day for 15 years. Dark brown stains covered the brim. I don't mind admitting this now. I almost left right then. Every instinct I had screamed to get back into the boat and disappear. But grief makes people irrational. You spend months wanting answers badly enough that fear starts feeling secondary. I stepped inside. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance. Dust, mildew, dirty dishes. But then I noticed fresh footprints across the floorboards. Bare feet, long, too long, and wet. The prints disappeared into a hallway leading toward the back rooms. I called out carefully. "Hello?" Nothing. Then from somewhere deeper inside the cabin came a soft creak. Floorboards shifting, followed by slow breathing. I backed toward the front door instinctively. That was when I noticed the photographs. Dozens of old Polaroids pinned across one wall. People standing beside fish catches, families smiling near boats, hunters holding rifles, normal swamp pictures, except every face had been scratched out, violently, all except one. My father. His face remained untouched in every photo. Underneath the picture, someone had written the same sentence repeatedly across the wall in black marker. He kept talking to it, over and over. He kept talking to it. I heard the breathing again, closer now, wet, uneven. I turned my flashlight toward the hallway and saw someone standing there. Tall, extremely thin. Its body disappeared into darkness above the chest, but I could see pale, bare legs and one long arm hanging at its side. Not moving, just standing there, listening. I froze completely. The figure tilted its head slightly. Then it spoke in my father's voice. "Eli." My blood turned to ice. Perfect imitation. Not close, perfect, same rough smoker's rasp, same slow drawl. "Boy," it whispered. I stumbled backward immediately. "No." The thing took one slow step forward into the flashlight beam. Its skin looked gray and swollen in patches, stretched too tightly over bones in some places and hanging loose in others. Water dripped constantly from its body onto the floorboards, and its face looked unfinished. Features shifting subtly beneath wet skin, like multiple people pressed against translucent rubber, trying to emerge. Then it smiled, using my father's mouth. "You came back." I ran. Not bravery, not strategy, pure, animal, panic. I burst out onto the dock and nearly slipped into the water. Behind me, the cabin exploded with movement. Something huge slammed through the doorway, hard enough to splinter wood. I sprinted across the walkway while fog rolled thick across the swamp around me. Then the whistling started again, not behind me, all around me, different directions, different distances, like multiple people hidden throughout the reeds. The dock shook violently beneath my feet. Something hit it from underneath. Boards cracked. I barely caught myself before falling into black water below. Then came my father's voice from somewhere beside the walkway, calm, gentle. Eli, stop running. I flashed the light toward the sound. Nothing there, just reeds swaying slightly. Please, the voice continued softly. It gets angry when you run. Something moved beneath the water, beside the dock, large, keeping pace with me. I could see pale shapes just below the surface. Hands. Too many hands. The walkway ended near the boat. I jumped inside and yanked the starter cord repeatedly, while panic made my hands clumsy. The engine sputtered once. Died. Behind me came slow footsteps on the dock, not rushed, confident. The flashlight beam caught it fully for the first time. Tall enough its head nearly brushed hanging moss overhead. Limbs too long, fingers dangling near its knees, skin slick with black swamp water, and parts of it moved independently. Faces pressed outward beneath its flesh briefly, before sinking back inside. One of them was my father, not exactly him, an impression of him, like memory trapped in meat. It smiled again. Then every sound in the swamp stopped, instantly. No insects, no frogs, absolute silence. The creature opened its mouth, and multiple voices came out at once, whispering, begging, laughing. My father's voice rose above the others. You shouldn't have come alone. Then something grabbed the bottom of the boat from underneath. The entire hull lurched sideways, violently. I fell hard against the railing. Another impact hit. Wood cracked beneath me. Pale fingers curled briefly over the side of the boat before vanishing back underwater. The engine finally roared alive. I slammed the throttle forward. The boat tore through black water while things moved beside me in the swamp, fast. Sometimes I saw shapes between trees pacing the shoreline. Sometimes pale faces floating just beneath the water surface. And always the whistling, following. Hours later, I reached the marina just before sunrise. The old man from before stood exactly where I'd left him, like he'd been waiting. One look at me, and he sighed quietly. You saw it? I couldn't speak. He nodded toward the swamp. Your daddy kept hearing voices out there after Hurricane Ivan. Said something was talking to him from the water at night. What is it? The old man cleaned his knife silently for a moment. Whatever drowns out there don't always stay drowned. I left Alabama 6 weeks later, moved north, started over. I haven't touched a boat since, but sometimes, late at night, especially during heavy rain, I hear whistling outside my apartment complex. Slow, aimless, patient. People think the worst thing about the southern swamps is getting lost. It isn't. Getting lost implies there's still a direction to find. The worst thing is when the swamp starts feeling familiar. When every stretch of black water begins looking like somewhere you've already been. When the trees stop resembling trees and start resembling people standing just outside your flashlight beam. When the sounds become recognizable. When you realize something out there has been listening to you long enough to learn you. I haven't told this story publicly before. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway, and honestly, part of me hopes they never do. The ones who laugh at stories like this are the same ones who disappear, because they think fear is stupidity instead of instinct. This happened in October of 2017, down in the Honey Island swamp outside New Orleans. I was 29 then, recently sober, recently unemployed. Human beings love self-destruction so much we'll package it as fresh starts and drive directly into wilderness carrying unresolved trauma like extra luggage. My younger brother Tyler called me about the job. You still got your drone equipment? He asked. Depends who's asking. A guy wants aerial footage of abandoned fishing camps before they bulldoze them. Why me? Because you're broke. Well, fair enough. Tyler was 6 years younger than me and somehow looked 10 years older. Sunken cheeks, stringy blonde hair always tucked beneath a dirty Saints cap. He had that permanently exhausted look people get after years of bad sleep and worse decisions. He worked odd salvage jobs around flooded properties and remote campsites. Mostly legal, probably. The client was a man named Vernon, who met us at a marina just before sunset. Vernon looked like the swamp had built him out of driftwood and nicotine, tall but bent slightly forward, gray beard stained yellow near the mouth, one cloudy eye, skin leathered dark from decades under southern sun. You boys ever been deep in Honey Island? He asked. Not really, I said. Good. That was his entire response. The marina itself sat in suffocating heat, despite autumn technically existing on the calendar. Humidity clung to my skin immediately. Mosquitoes swarmed in dense clouds beneath flickering dock lights. The air smelled like mud, gasoline, algae, and dead fish baking somewhere unseen. Beyond the dock stretched endless black water and walls of cypress trees draped in hanging moss. The swamp looked asleep, but not peacefully, more like something pretending to sleep while listening. Vernon's boat was an old aluminum mud skiff with cracked seats and a failing outboard motor that coughed thick smoke every few minutes. You sure this thing floats? Tyler asked. She floats enough. Not reassuring. We pushed off just after dark. That's the first thing people get wrong about swamps in movies. They think moonlight makes them beautiful. Moonlight makes them worse. The water becomes reflective enough that depth disappears completely. Trees double themselves across the surface. Every ripple looks like movement beneath you. Fog drifts low across the marsh until sky and water blend together into one endless gray void. The deeper we traveled, the quieter Tyler became. Normally, he talked nonstop when nervous. Bad jokes, random observations, anything to fill silence. But after about an hour, even he stopped. The swamp had started making noises around us. Not loud noises, subtle ones. Splashes far away, branches cracking deep in the reeds. Movement in water that stopped whenever we looked toward it. Once I heard what sounded like somebody coughing somewhere out in the darkness. Vernon noticed me looking. Ain't nobody out here, he muttered. You sure? Positive. Then he added quietly, at least not nobody normal. Tyler laughed nervously. Jesus Christ, you old swamp guys really love saying creepy shit. Vernon ignored him. We reached the first abandoned camp around midnight. 3 cabins sat elevated on warped stilts above shallow black water. Rusted fan boats rested half-sunken nearby, beneath layers of algae and vines. Broken crab traps hung from poles like skeletons. Everything looked abandoned, but not old abandoned. Recent. There's a difference. Old abandoned places decay naturally. This place looked left behind. Suddenly, a coffee mug still sat on one porch railing. Fishing rods leaned beside a doorway. A lantern hung from a hook, gently swaying despite absolutely no wind. The smell hit me first stepping onto the dock. Rot. Not just swamp rot either. Something heavier underneath, like meat left inside a hot car. Tyler covered his nose. What died? Vernon stared toward the cabins. Nobody found out. That answer bothered me immediately. We unloaded camera equipment while insects screamed endlessly in the trees around us. Huge dragonflies skimmed over stagnant water. Something large splashed nearby every few minutes without revealing itself. I noticed strange marks carved into several dock posts, deep scratches, too evenly spaced to be random. What made those? I asked. Vernon wouldn't answer directly. You hear anything calling your name tonight, you ignore it. Tyler snorted. What is this, Blair Witch for rednecks? Vernon finally looked at him, not angry, but scared. You think I'm joking because you still think people are on top of the food chain out here. That shut Tyler up for a while. We spent the next hour filming the camps while thick fog rolled over the water. My drone footage kept glitching, unexpectedly. Signal loss, sudden static interference. One time, the camera briefly captured what looked like movement beneath the water, beside the dock. Long, pale shapes, too long to be gators. When I replayed the footage seconds later, nothing was there. Around 1 a.m, we entered the largest cabin. The inside looked wrong, not messy, interrupted. A pot still sat on the stove, covered in mold. Playing cards scattered across the table. Muddy footprints tracked through the room toward a hallway. Human footprints, barefoot, but impossibly long. Tyler crouched beside one. What the hell? The toes looked stretched unnaturally, and deep. Whatever made them carried serious weight. Then we noticed the walls, writing-covered parts of the wood paneling. Not graffiti, messages. Don't answer it. It waits under the water. It knows our voices. Tyler tried laughing again, but it sounded weak now. Probably meth heads. Then we found the bedroom. The mattress looked shredded apart. Dark stains covered the walls and ceiling. And nailed above the bed frame was a raccoon carcass, skinned almost surgically clean. Tyler backed out immediately. Nah, even Vernon looked shaken now. We leave before dawn, he muttered. Why dawn? I asked. He stared toward the dark hallway. Because it gets brave near dawn. I wish we'd left right then. Instead, Tyler insisted on exploring the nearby docks for more footage. That decision probably ruined both our lives. The farther we walked from camp, the denser the swamp became. Reeds rose shoulder high from black water. Mud sucked at our boots, hard enough to nearly pull them off. Humid air pressed against my chest like wet fabric. Every flashlight beam felt too weak, too narrow. The swamp absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Then we found the boat, half hidden beneath hanging moss, maybe 50 yards from camp. Old wooden fishing boat lodged against cypress roots. Tyler climbed inside first. Dude, his voice changed instantly. I stepped closer. Bones, human bones, scattered across the bottom of the boat. Not a skeleton, pieces. Skull cracked open along one side. Ribs, finger bones, and tangled among them. Cassette tapes, dozens of them. Vernon whispered, Jesus. Tyler picked one up, written across masking tape in faded marker. May 14th. Heard Mama again. I suddenly became aware that the swamp noises had stopped, completely. No insects, no frogs, nothing. Just silence. Heavy silence. The kind that presses against your ears. Then came the voice. Tyler. Soft, distant, female. Tyler froze instantly. It sounded exactly like our mother. Dead 6 years by then. His face drained white. Did you hear that? I grabbed his arm immediately. Don't. The voice came again from deeper in the reeds. Closer now. Tyler, baby. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Same tired southern accent. Same softness. Tyler started shaking. That's Mom. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Vernon backed away fast. We need to move. The voice interrupted him. Vernon. His expression collapsed instantly. Now it sounded like a man. Older. Vern, help me, Vernon whispered. No. Then something moved in the water beside us. Not swimming, standing. A shape slowly rose from the black surface, maybe 20 feet away. At first I thought it was a man. Then lightning flashed somewhere far off, behind clouds, and I saw it clearly for half a second. Its body looked stretched and swollen simultaneously. Gray skin hung loose in places and tight in others, like mismatched human flesh pulled over the wrong frame. Long arms dangled nearly to the water. Its face... God. Its face kept changing, not transforming dramatically, subtly shifting, features rearranging. For 1 second it resembled my brother, then my mother, then someone else entirely, like human faces floating beneath skin. Its mouth opened slowly, too wide, and from inside came my mother's voice again. Come here. Tyler stepped toward the water. I grabbed him hard enough to nearly throw him backward. The creature moved instantly, faster than anything that size should move. It exploded through shallow water toward us on all fours. The sound it made, not roaring, imitating, multiple human screams layered together. We ran. Mud swallowed our legs, nearly knee-deep. Branches tore at our faces. Something crashed behind us through reeds with horrifying speed. Tyler slipped once and screamed. I turned just long enough to see pale fingers brush the back of his shirt before he scrambled upright again. We reached the camp, gasping for breath. Vernon was already trying to start the boat engine. Hurry! Then the voices began surrounding us. Not one voice. Dozens. Men, women, children, some crying, some laughing, all calling from darkness beyond the fog. And every single one sounded human, perfectly human. One voice begged for help from somewhere beneath the dock. Another screamed from deep in the trees. One whispered directly behind me, "Don't leave me." I spun around. Nothing there. Then Tyler froze, staring toward cabin 2. A silhouette stood inside the doorway. My mother. Or something wearing her shape. She looked exactly as she had before cancer took her apart. Thin robe, tired smile, gray streaks in her hair. Even from 30 feet away, I could see tears on her cheeks. Tyler, she whispered. My brother started sobbing, and for one horrible second, even I believed it. That's the terrifying part. Not that it looked wrong, that it looked right, too right. Then lightning flashed again, and her smile stretched impossibly wide. The jaw unhinged farther than human anatomy allowed. Rows of broken teeth unfolded inside her mouth. Tyler screamed. The thing charged. Vernon fired his shotgun point blank from the boat. The blast tore through its shoulder. But instead of blood, dark swamp water poured out. The creature collapsed sideways into the marsh with a sound like wet garbage hitting concrete. Then it started laughing in my mother's voice. We escaped seconds before shapes began emerging from the water all around the dock. Not one creature, several, or one thing appearing in several places at once. Tall, pale bodies rising silently from black water, watching us leave. The boat engine screamed while we tore through narrow swamp channels at full speed. Behind us, the voices followed through the darkness. Calling, begging, imitating, then came the crash beneath the boat. Something slammed the hull hard enough to lift one side from the water. Tyler screamed. Another impact hit. The engine sputtered. And for one brief moment, during a lightning flash, I saw pale faces moving beneath the surface alongside us. Human faces, eyes open underwater, mouths moving, trying to speak. The third impact flipped the boat. I still dream about that water. Warm, pitch black, full of movement. I surfaced, choking, while rain hammered down around me. Tyler was screaming somewhere nearby. Then, suddenly, cut off. I never saw him again. I swam blindly through reeds until sunrise. Search teams found me 2 days later, dehydrated and half delirious, nearly 15 miles from the marina. They never found Tyler. Or Vernon. But 6 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was one of the cassette tapes from that boat, nothing else. I listened to it once. A man was crying on the recording, begging somebody not to answer voices outside his cabin. Then near the end, another voice started repeating his words back to him. Perfectly. Right before the tape cut off, I heard something else in the background, splashing, getting closer. The first thing people get wrong about swamps is thinking they're empty. People imagine endless stretches of quiet water, old trees, the occasional alligator slipping beneath the surface. They think it's wilderness untouched by man. It isn't. The swamp remembers everyone who has ever entered it, every hunter, every fisherman, every fugitive, every child who wandered too far from a campsite, every body that was never found. Some places keep history in books. The swamp keeps it beneath the water. I know because I spent 3 nights inside it. Even now, nearly 11 years later, I can't drive across a bridge without looking down into the water. Every flooded ditch beside a highway makes my hands tighten around the steering wheel. If I hear frogs suddenly stop croaking at night, I close every blind in my house. My therapist says trauma rewires the brain. Maybe. Or maybe she's never stood in chest-deep black water while something walked circles around her that refused to make a sound. Back in October of 2015, I was 37 years old and working as a land surveyor throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days were spent carrying GPS equipment through forests, marshes, abandoned farmland, and construction sites while developers argued over property lines that had existed longer than any of us would. The money was decent, the hours weren't. My wife, Melissa, used to joke that she saw mosquitoes more often than she saw me. She wasn't wrong. We'd been married 13 years, had one daughter named Emma, and lived outside Baton Rouge in a small brick house that always smelled faintly of coffee and crayons. Emma was 8 then, obsessed with dinosaurs, despite being able to pronounce only half their names correctly. Every time I left for another week of field work, she'd tuck one of her plastic toy dinosaurs into my backpack, so the woods wouldn't be lonely. I still have every single one, except the one I carried into the swamp that week never came back. The phone call arrived on a Monday morning. My supervisor, Rick, sounded unusually excited. Government contract. Meaning? State Wildlife Survey. I hate when you sound optimistic. Rick laughed. 3 days. Maybe 4. Easy money. Whenever someone in surveying says easy money, prepare yourself to suffer in increasingly creative ways. He explained the job during the drive to our office. The state wanted updated topographical data from a section of protected wetlands slated for environmental review. Nothing unusual there. What was unusual was the location. The Black Cypress Preserve. I'd never heard of it. Neither had anyone else in the office. Rick spread an old paper map across the conference table. There. He tapped a patch of green surrounded by waterways. No roads? Not anymore. What happened to them? He shrugged. Floods, apparently. That word would haunt me later. because every strange thing about that assignment was followed by, apparently. Apparently, the preserve had once supported logging camps. Apparently, several fishing communities abandoned the area during the 1970s. Apparently, locals refused to hunt there now. Apparently, nobody had completed a full survey in nearly 30 years. Surveyors don't usually ask why. You get coordinates, you collect data, you leave. Curiosity isn't part of the job description. It should have been. I met the rest of the team before sunrise on Wednesday, at an aging marina tucked beside a sluggish bayou. Mist drifted over black water like cigarette smoke. The air already felt heavy enough to breathe through. Mosquitoes hovered beneath yellow dock lights in dense swarms. Somewhere beyond the tree line, insects screamed endlessly, not chirping, screaming. Waiting beside an aluminum airboat was my partner, Dean. Dean had surveyed with me for almost 6 years, 44, former Army engineer, broad shoulders, close-cropped gray hair, permanent 5 o'clock shadow. He possessed the irritating confidence of someone who had survived enough genuinely dangerous situations to stop respecting ordinary danger altogether. "If this place has mosquitoes bigger than sparrows," he said while loading equipment, "I'm billing the state for emotional damages." Behind him stood our wildlife liaison, Grace, 32, tall, lean, dark brown hair braided beneath a faded LSU baseball cap, sunburn across her nose, quiet eyes that missed almost nothing. She carried binoculars around her neck and wore mud-stained chest waders, despite the oppressive heat. Unlike Dean, Grace wasn't joking. She kept watching the tree line, like she expected someone, or something. Our final teammate arrived 5 minutes later, Elias, local guide, 68 years old. Thin enough his clothes seemed to hang from him. Skin weathered like cracked leather. White beard stained brown from decades of chewing tobacco. His left hand shook constantly. His right never did. He carried an ancient 12-gauge shotgun, despite the state paperwork specifically forbidding firearms. Rick noticed immediately. "You can't bring that." Elias looked at him for a long moment. "Then y'all don't have to bring me." Nobody argued after that. The ride into Black Cypress Preserve took nearly 3 hours. With every mile, the signs of civilization disappeared. Boat launches became abandoned docks. Abandoned docks became collapsed walkways. Eventually, even those vanished beneath reeds and stagnant water. The swamp swallowed everything. Towering cypress trees rose from black water like cathedral pillars. Their massive roots twisted through mud that looked thick enough to swallow trucks whole. Long curtains of Spanish moss hung motionless, despite almost no wind. The humid air tasted of wet bark, algae, old wood, and something faintly rotten hiding beneath it all. Grace occasionally pointed toward distant wildlife. River otters, great blue herons, an enormous alligator slipping silently beneath lily pads. Dean photographed everything. I concentrated on navigation coordinates. Elias never stopped scanning the shoreline. Not the water, the trees. Every 20 or 30 minutes, he'd quietly spit tobacco overboard and mutter something under his breath in Cajun French. Eventually, Dean asked, "What are you looking for?" Elias answered without turning. "Places that got quieter." Dean laughed. "The whole swamp's quiet." "No." The old man finally looked back at us. "When a swamp gets quiet," he paused, "it means something else started listening." Nobody laughed after Elias said that. It wasn't because the words themselves were frightening. Out in southern Louisiana, old-timers were always saying things that sounded like they belonged in ghost stories. It was the way he said them. Calm, matter-of-fact, like he wasn't trying to scare us, like he was simply explaining the weather. Dean eventually broke the silence. "You always this cheerful?" Elias shrugged without looking away from the trees. "I've buried enough friends to quit pretending certain places don't have rules." Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You've been here before?" The old guide nodded once. "Long time ago." "When?" 1983. "What happened?" For several seconds, the only sounds were the growl of the airboat engine and thousands of insects buzzing somewhere deep inside the swamp. Finally, Elias spoke. "I came in with 6 men." He paused. "I left by myself." Dean glanced at me and quietly rolled his eyes. Every profession has storytellers. Surveying has old contractors who claim they've mapped haunted battlefields. Fishermen swear they've seen ghost lights dancing across marshes. Loggers talk about hearing axes chopping in forests where nobody has worked in 50 years. I assumed Elias belonged to that club. I would spend the next 3 days wishing he didn't. The further south we traveled, the more unnatural the swamp became. The waterways narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the airboat. Dense reeds rose over our heads, shutting out what little breeze existed. Thick mats of duckweed covered sections of water so completely they looked solid enough to walk across. The humidity became almost unbearable. Every breath felt like inhaling through a warm, wet towel. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite barely moving. Mosquitoes landed faster than I could slap them away. The smell changed, too. At first, it had been the familiar scent of freshwater marshes, mud, wet bark, river moss. Now another odor drifted through the air, faint, sweet, wrong, like something large had died weeks ago and the swamp had only partially hidden it. Grace noticed it too. "You smell that?" Dean wrinkled his nose. "Dead hog, maybe." Elias didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the shotgun resting across his knees. Around noon, we reached the survey base. Calling it a camp felt generous. 3 weathered cabins sat on raised wooden stilts surrounded by black water and towering cypress trees. Rotting boardwalks connected the buildings, many of the planks warped so badly they bowed beneath their own weight. An old generator shed leaned dangerously to one side. Rusted fuel drums sat half submerged beside a collapsed dock. A faded sign still hung from a post near shore. Black Cypress Logging Company, established 1949. The lower half of the sign had rotted away decades earlier. The place looked frozen in time. Like everyone living there had simply stood up one afternoon and walked into the swamp without packing a single thing. Dean climbed onto the dock first. The boards groaned beneath his weight. "Structurally questionable," he muttered. "That's optimistic," I answered. Grace stepped onto the dock behind him and looked around. No birds. I hadn't noticed until she said it. There weren't any, no egrets, no herons, not even crows. For a swamp that should have been overflowing with wildlife, the silence suddenly felt unsettling. The insects still buzzed constantly, but everything larger was gone. We spent the next hour unloading equipment: GPS receivers, tripods, survey poles, camera drones, solar charging kits, food coolers, sleeping bags. The state expected us to spend 3 nights documenting elevation changes throughout nearly 15 square miles of wetlands. It sounded exhausting. It didn't sound dangerous. Once everything was inside the largest cabin, Dean flopped into an old rocking chair on the porch. "I've definitely slept in worse." Grace laughed. "You've also slept in Afghanistan." "Exactly." Elias remained standing, still watching the tree line, still listening. "You folks lock every door tonight." Dean smirked. "From who?" The old man looked at him. "Doesn't matter." He spoke so quietly we almost missed it. "If something knocks after midnight..." He paused. "Don't answer." Dean laughed again. "You really committed to this haunted swamp thing." Elias didn't react. "I ain't talking about ghosts." The cabin still had electricity. Barely. An aging diesel generator behind the storage shed powered a handful of dim yellow lights inside each building. The wiring crackled constantly. Every few minutes the lights flickered. Grace frowned toward the shed. "That generator's on borrowed time." Dean shrugged. "We only need it 3 days." "You hope?" By late afternoon, we'd completed our first section of survey work. The preserve was even stranger on foot. Every step became a fight against sucking mud that tried to pull our boots off. Cypress knees jutted from the earth like sharpened stakes hidden beneath leaves. Vines hung low enough to wrap around our faces. Visibility rarely exceeded 50 feet. The swamp folded around itself. Every direction looked identical. Without GPS equipment, we'd have been hopelessly lost within an hour. Occasionally, we'd stop to record coordinates while Grace documented local wildlife. She frowned more with every observation. Tracks disappeared. What tracks? Everything. She crouched near a muddy bank. Normally, we'd see raccoons, deer, hogs, birds. She pointed at the untouched mud. "Nothing." Dean shrugged. "Maybe we're too loud." Grace slowly shook her head. "No." She looked around uneasily. "It feels like everything already left." We reached our final marker just before sunset. The sky burned deep orange behind endless walls of cypress trees. Long shadows stretched across the black water. Fog began drifting slowly over the marsh. The temperature didn't drop. If anything, the air somehow felt heavier. Returning to camp took longer than expected. Twice we found ourselves following trails that simply ended. Not at water, not at fallen trees, just ended, as though the swamp had quietly erased them. Even our GPS briefly lost signal. Dean frowned at the receiver. "That's impossible." I checked mine. Same thing. Blank screen, no satellites, no coordinates, nothing. It lasted less than 30 seconds. Then everything returned to normal. Nobody mentioned it. Dinner consisted of canned chili heated over a propane stove. Nobody complained. After 8 hours hiking through waist-high marsh, hot food tasted incredible. Darkness settled quickly around the cabins. Beyond the porch light, the swamp became an ocean of shifting shadows. The moon reflected across the water in broken silver ribbons. Spanish moss swayed lazily overhead. Somewhere in the distance, something splashed. Not once, repeatedly, large, deliberate. Dean looked toward the sound. Gator? Grace listened carefully. No. What then? She hesitated. I don't know. That answer bothered me more than if she'd simply guessed. Grace had spent 12 years studying wetlands throughout Louisiana. She identified birds by sound alone, recognized animal tracks instantly. If she didn't know, that meant something. Around 9 o'clock, the generator suddenly coughed. The lights dimmed, recovered, then dimmed again. Dean sighed. I'll check it. I'll come, I said. We grabbed flashlights and walked toward the small shed behind the cabins. The moment we left the porch, the atmosphere changed. It was difficult to explain. The swamp suddenly felt aware. Every instinct I had told me someone was watching, not from one direction, from everywhere. The flashlight beams bounced across reeds and twisted tree trunks. Nothing, just darkness, just swamp, just the constant buzzing of insects. Then Dean stopped walking. You hear that? I listened. At first, nothing. Then, very faintly, somewhere beyond the trees, came the sound of a woman humming, soft, almost gentle, like someone quietly singing to themselves while working. Dean frowned. Who's out here? I answered immediately. There isn't supposed to be anybody. The humming continued. Same melody, slow and patient, and it sounded close. Then farther away, then close again, like it wasn't traveling through the swamp normally. Dean called out, "Hello?" The humming stopped instantly, complete silence. Then, from somewhere much deeper in the darkness, the same voice softly answered, "Hello?" Dean looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke, because it had answered in his voice. For nearly 10 seconds, neither of us moved. The humid air felt thick enough to drink. Mosquitoes buzzed around our faces, but I barely noticed them anymore. Dean finally laughed, not because he thought it was funny, because people laugh when their brains can't immediately process what just happened. You heard that, right? I heard it. It copied me. I didn't answer, because it had, perfectly. Same tone, same gravel in his voice, same slight southern drawl, not an imitation, an exact recording. Dean raised his flashlight and swept it slowly across the wall of cypress trees surrounding us. Nothing, just towering trunks rising out of waist-deep black water. Spanish moss hung from branches like gray curtains. Dense reeds swayed gently, although I couldn't feel even the slightest breeze. The swamp had become impossibly still. The insects had stopped, not faded, stopped, every cricket, every frog, every mosquito. The silence felt enormous. Dean swallowed. I'm going to check the generator. His voice sounded smaller now. I nodded without taking my eyes off the tree line. Neither of us wanted to admit we were suddenly afraid. The generator shed stood about 40 yards behind the cabins. It was little more than a weathered wooden shack with a corrugated metal roof stained orange from decades of rust. Dean pulled open the warped door. The old diesel engine rattled violently inside, coughing clouds of dark exhaust through a pipe that disappeared into the trees. He crouched beside it, fuel lines vibrating. You know anything about generators? No. He smacked it with the handle of his flashlight. The engine immediately smoothed out. I laughed. You just fixed government equipment by hitting it. Worked for my dad's truck. As the engine steadied, electricity returned to the cabins. Warm yellow light spilled across the dock again. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then we heard footsteps. Not ours, slow and heavy, walking somewhere beyond the shed. Crunch, 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 like someone stepping carefully through wet leaves. Dean looked toward the darkness. Grace? No answer. He called louder. Elias? Still nothing. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, crunch. One more step. Much closer. Dean whispered, "Who's there?" Silence. Then something splashed heavily in the water behind us. We spun around. Flashlights cut across the reeds. Rippling black water, floating duckweed, nothing else. Then smell hit us a second later. Rotting meat, fresh, powerful. so strong I covered my nose. Dean grimaced. Jesus. The odor vanished almost immediately, like someone had carried it away. Neither of us spoke during the walk back. Grace met us halfway across the dock. You two okay? Dean nodded too quickly. Fine. You were gone 20 minutes. I frowned. What? You've been out there almost half an hour. I looked at my watch. 8:47. We had left the porch at 8:25. 22 minutes. It felt like 5. Dean stared at his own watch. No. Grace looked confused. What? We weren't gone that long. She shrugged. I looked twice. Neither of us argued, but I could see from Dean's face that he'd noticed the same thing I had. Time hadn't felt right. Dinner resumed quietly. Nobody mentioned the voice. I considered telling the others. Then I looked at Dean. He subtly shook his head. Not yet. Elias finished eating first. He carefully cleaned his bowl, folded his hands, and looked toward the darkness beyond the porch. They're early. Nobody spoke. Dean finally asked, Who's early? The listeners. Silence. Grace sighed. Elias? The old guide looked at all three of us. You think I'm crazy? No one answered. I used to think that too. His eyes drifted toward the swamp. Back when I was younger, he leaned back in his chair. My grandfather trapped these swamps before roads came through. His father did the same before him. Dean smiled politely. Here comes the ghost story. Elias ignored him. They never feared alligators. They feared people? No. He shook his head. They feared anything that answered back. The porch had grown strangely cold. Not much, only a few degrees. Enough that I noticed goosebumps rising on my arms despite the humidity. Elias continued quietly. My grandfather used to say there are places where the swamp learns people. Dean chuckled. Swamps don't learn. No. The old man nodded toward the darkness. But something inside them does. Nobody interrupted him now. The first thing it learns, he raised one finger, is your footsteps. Another finger. Then your breathing. A third. Then your voice. The porch fell completely silent. Grace shifted uneasily. What are you talking about? Elias answered with complete sincerity. If you stay long enough, he swallowed, eventually it don't have to watch you anymore. Dean forced another laugh. So what's it do then? The old man met his eyes. It waits until somebody else comes looking. Around 10:30, everyone turned in. Dean and I shared the largest cabin. Grace slept in the smaller building across the boardwalk. Elias refused. He spread a sleeping bag beneath the covered porch instead. Dean joked, You scared of cabins? Elias quietly replied, I'm scared of not hearing what's coming. I didn't sleep, not really. The swamp never stopped moving. Water lapped softly beneath the floorboards. Branches scraped the roof. Something splashed every few minutes somewhere beyond visibility. Around midnight, rain began, gentle at first, tiny droplets tapping across the metal roof, then heavier. Within minutes, the entire swamp disappeared behind sheets of rain. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. Lightning occasionally illuminated the trees in brilliant white flashes. Each flash froze the swamp into a photograph. Then darkness swallowed it again. I must have drifted off briefly, because the next thing I remember was knocking. 3 soft knocks. Tap, 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 not loud, patient. Coming from the front porch. Dean sat upright instantly. You hear that? Before I answered, 3 more knocks echoed through the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was outside. We both reached for our flashlights. Dean whispered, Who's knocking at 1 a.m? I remembered Elias. If something knocks after midnight, don't answer. Dean slowly stood. The knocking came again. Exactly 3 taps, perfectly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. Then, a woman's voice. Soft, barely above a whisper. Please. Dean froze. The voice sounded terrified. I need help. Another flash of lightning filled the cabin. For a split second, I could see Dean's face. He looked torn between caution and instinct. The voice came again, closer. I'm hurt. Then, very quietly, I can hear you inside. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Because we hadn't made a sound. And yet, whatever was outside knew exactly where we were. Nobody moved. The rain hammered against the tin roof so hard it almost drowned out the knocking. Almost. Tap, tap, tap. 3 perfectly measured knocks. Then silence. Dean slowly looked toward me. His voice was barely audible. Tell me that's Elias. I wanted to. I wanted a simple explanation. Maybe the old man had forgotten something. Maybe Grace needed help. Instead, I remembered exactly what Elias had said only a few hours earlier. If something knocks after midnight, don't answer. The voice outside came again, soft, female, weak enough that I had to strain to hear it. Please. Another pause. I'm cold. Dean reached for the door. I grabbed his wrist. No. What if somebody's hurt? Then why aren't they saying who they are? He didn't answer. Because he'd realized the same thing. Nobody outside had called our names. Nobody had identified themselves. Just, please. The knocking returned. 3 taps, exactly the same rhythm. No harder, no faster, like whoever stood outside knew we'd eventually give in. Lightning flashed. For a split second, pale white light spilled through the dusty cabin windows. I instinctively looked toward the front porch. Nothing, only rain, the outline of the railing, swinging Spanish moss. Darkness swallowed everything again. Dean whispered, I didn't see anybody. I know. Another flash. This time, I saw feet, bare feet, standing perfectly still on the porch. The rest of whoever it belonged to remained hidden outside my field of view. Just 2 pale feet, completely motionless. Rain poured over them. They never shifted, never adjusted, never reacted to the cold. I held my breath. Lightning disappeared, darkness again. Dean hadn't seen them. His flashlight remained pointed toward the floor. The voice returned, closer now. So cold. It sounded exhausted, human, real. Then, without warning, the voice changed, not dramatically, subtly. The accent disappeared, the tone lowered. The breathing changed. It became Grace. Dean, my stomach dropped. Dean's head snapped upward. Grace? Her voice came immediately. I'm outside. No, I whispered. She's across the boardwalk. Dean stared at me. But that's her voice. It isn't. He looked unconvinced. The voice continued. I need help. Then something impossible happened. From outside Grace's actual cabin, we heard another voice. Elias? That was Grace. The real Grace. Calling into the darkness. The fake voice on our porch fell completely silent. Dean slowly backed away from the door. Neither of us breathed. The cabin suddenly felt far too small. Then came shouting. Dean, Grace again, this time frantic. Marcus! We sprinted to the door. Before I could stop him, Dean threw it open. The porch was empty. No footprints, no person, no bare feet, only rain pounding against old wood. The swamp beyond the porch looked darker than before, almost black despite the lightning. Grace stood nearly 50 yards away outside her own cabin, flashlight shaking in her hand. Elias is gone. We crossed the boardwalk at a run. The wood groaned beneath every step. Water splashed below us. Wind whipped the hanging moss violently now as the storm intensified. Grace met us halfway. Her face had lost all color. I woke up because someone was talking. What did they say? I thought it was Elias. She swallowed hard. He kept saying somebody was outside. Was he? She shook her head. When I came out, she looked toward the porch where the old guide had been sleeping. His bed was empty. Sleeping bag, blanket, lantern, shotgun. Everything remained exactly where he'd left it, except Elias. Dean called into the darkness. Elias, nothing, again. Loud enough for the dead to hear. Still nothing. The swamp absorbed every sound. Then, far off, somewhere beyond the trees, came a single shotgun blast. Everyone froze. Grace whispered, that was his gun. Another flash of lightning. Thunder rolled overhead. The echo of the gunshot disappeared into endless marsh. Dean looked at me. We have to find him. Every instinct I possessed screamed not to leave the camp. Every professional instinct screamed the opposite. You don't abandon someone alone in conditions like these, especially not a 68-year-old man. We grabbed rain gear, extra flashlights, and the emergency radio. The GPS receiver struggled to lock onto satellites through the storm. Signal came, went, returned, disappeared again. Dean cursed. They're useless. I looked toward the black wall of trees surrounding camp. How far could he have gone? Nobody answered. The rain eased slightly as we stepped into the swamp. Immediately the mud tried pulling our boots off. Each footstep disappeared ankle deep into black muck that smelled of sulfur and decay. Water collected inside my boots almost instantly. Flashlight beams bounced through sheets of rain, illuminating twisted cypress trunks and curtains of Spanish moss that looked disturbingly like hanging bodies whenever lightning flashed. Everything beyond 30 feet dissolved into darkness. Dean called again. Elias. Silence. Then, Very faintly, from somewhere ahead, came the old man's voice. I'm over here. Dean immediately started forward. I caught his shoulder. The voice had come from the left, but the footprints we'd been following continued straight ahead. Grace noticed it too. She whispered he would have had to walk through water. There were no tracks, only mud. Then the voice called again. I'm all right. This time, it came from our right. Dean slowly lowered his flashlight. He's moving? No, I said quietly. Listen. The voice repeated the exact same sentence, exactly the same way. Same pause, same breathing, same inflection, like a recording. I'm over here, again, perfectly identical. Grace covered her mouth. Oh my God. Dean finally understood. That's not him. Then every flashlight flickered. Once, twice, went out. Complete darkness, not ordinary darkness, absolute. The kind that erases distance, the kind where you can't even see your own hands. Rain dripped from leaves, water sloshed around our boots. Somewhere close by, something exhaled, long, slow, wet. I could hear Grace beginning to panic. Marcus, I'm here. I can't see you. Neither could I. Then, all around us, the swamp came alive. Voices, whispering, hundreds of them, too quiet to understand. Men, women, children, some laughing, some crying, some praying, all hidden somewhere beyond the darkness. Dean whispered, "What the hell?" One flashlight came back on, mine. Its beam cut through the rain. 30 feet ahead stood Elias, perfectly still, shotgun in one hand, hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, just standing there. Dean sighed in relief. There he is. Something felt wrong immediately. Elias? No response. He remained frozen. The rain poured over him. Not a single twitch, not a blink. Grace whispered, "Why isn't he answering?" Dean took one cautious step forward. "Elias?" The old man slowly raised his head. His face came into the flashlight beam. It was Elias. Every wrinkle, every strand of beard, every scar, perfect, except his eyes. They reflected the flashlight like an alligator's, bright, golden, completely motionless. Then, without opening his mouth, his voice came from somewhere behind us. "Don't move." All three of us spun around. Standing 20 yards behind us was the real Elias, soaked by rain, breathing hard, shotgun raised. His face was pale with terror. He shouted, "Don't you look back at it." My heart stopped. Because before I could obey, I heard footsteps splashing through the water behind me, coming closer, and something smiled, not with lips, with the sound it made. Nobody breathed. The rain drummed against the canopy overhead, rolling off broad cypress branches in heavy sheets. Water trickled down the backs of our necks, soaking through our jackets until the fabric clung to our skin. The air smelled of wet earth, stagnant water, and something older, something buried. The figure standing in my flashlight beam never moved. It looked exactly like Elias. The same faded green raincoat, the same battered felt hat, the same crooked shoulders that came from decades of hauling crab traps and dragging boats through marshes. Only those eyes. They reflected the light like polished amber. No blink, no expression, no life. Behind us, the real Elias shouted again, "Don't turn back toward it." Dean had already turned. So had Grace. So had I. The thing smiled, not with its mouth. Its shoulders lifted almost imperceptibly, as if it were enjoying the mistake we'd just made. Then every flashlight died again. Darkness swallowed us whole. I heard splashing, not running, walking, deliberate footsteps circling us. One splash, then another, always just beyond where I thought someone should be. My fingers tightened around the useless flashlight. Somewhere to my left, Grace whispered, "Marcus, I'm here." Dean answered from somewhere ahead, "I'm with you." Then another Dean answered, "No, you're not." The second voice came from behind me. Perfect. Exactly the same. Dean froze. "What?" Silence. Then the false voice chuckled. It wasn't an evil laugh. It sounded curious, like someone trying out a new sound. The real Elias barked an order. "Close your eyes." Nobody argued. I shut my eyes so tightly they hurt. The darkness behind my eyelids felt safer than whatever surrounded us. The footsteps continued. Closer now. I could hear water gently sloshing around bare feet. Not boots, feet, then breathing. Right beside me, slow, steady, warm enough that I could feel it against my cheek. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what stood inches away. Instead, I kept my eyes shut. The breathing lingered. Another long second. Then it drifted away. The footsteps followed. Splash, 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 retreating into the swamp. When Elias finally spoke again, his voice sounded exhausted. "You can look." My flashlight flickered back to life with a weak sputter. The storm had begun moving east, leaving only a light rain behind. The swamp looked exactly as it had before. Trees, water, fog, nothing else. The figure was gone. Dean turned slowly toward Elias. "What was that?" The old guy didn't answer immediately. He stared into the darkness where the copy had stood. Finally he said, "It learns." Grace looked confused. "What learns?" "The thing that don't belong." Dean shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the empty water. "I need a real answer." Elias met his eyes. "That's the only one I got." The walk back to camp took twice as long. Nobody wanted to speak above a whisper. Every few minutes we'd stop because someone thought they heard footsteps behind us. Every time, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. Not because I heard anything, because I kept catching movement just outside the edge of my flashlight beam. Not fast, not obvious. Just someone stepping behind a tree a fraction of a second before the light reached them. Too slow to be imagination. Too quick to confirm. When the cabins finally appeared through the fog, relief washed over me. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. The front door of our cabin stood wide open. Dean frowned. "I shut that." "I watched you shut it," Grace said. "The wind hadn't opened it. There wasn't enough wind. Besides, the door opened inward." Elias slowly raised his shotgun. "Nobody rushes." We approached one careful step at a time. The porch creaked beneath our boots. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof. The open doorway looked like a black hole cut into the cabin. Dean called inside. "Anybody there?" Nothing answered, not even an echo. The cabin smelled wrong, not rotten, not moldy, fresh, like wet river mud. A trail of black footprints crossed the wooden floor. Bare feet again, long, narrow, far larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The prints entered through the front door, wandered slowly around the room, stopped beside each of our sleeping bags, then left through the back door. Nobody spoke. Grace knelt beside one print. "It wasn't here earlier." Dean looked toward Elias. "Somebody came inside." The old man quietly replied, "No." He pointed at the floor. Something looked. We searched every room. Nothing. No broken windows, no missing equipment, no signs of forced entry. Everything remained exactly where we'd left it, except my backpack. It sat unzipped on the floor. I was certain I'd closed it. Inside, everything appeared untouched. Survey maps, extra batteries, notebook, compass. Then I noticed Emma's toy dinosaur, the little green plastic triceratops she'd hidden in my bag before I left home. It was sitting upright, facing the bedroom door. I had packed it at the bottom of the bag. I stared at it for several seconds. Dean noticed. "You all right?" I picked it up slowly. "I didn't leave this here." Nobody slept after that. Instead, we gathered around the kitchen table while the generator hummed outside. The yellow lights flickered every few minutes. Coffee brewed in an ancient metal pot. Nobody drank much of it. Around 3 a.m, Elias finally spoke. "My grandfather called them the Watchers." Dean sighed. "So they have a name?" "No." Elias shook his head. "That's what we called them because they never told us theirs." Grace leaned forward. "You've seen this before." The old guide stared into his untouched coffee. "When I was 19... He rubbed his hands together. "There were 6 of us. You said that earlier." "There were." A long silence settled over the cabin. We were trapping nutria after a flood. He looked toward the windows. We kept hearing another trapper calling for help. Dean folded his arms. "And?" "We found him." Another pause. He'd been dead almost a week. The room went completely still. Elias continued in the same flat tone. "But..." He swallowed. We kept hearing him anyway. The generator suddenly sputtered. The lights dimmed, recovered, dimmed again. Outside, the insects stopped, all at once. The silence arrived so abruptly it felt like someone had thrown a blanket over the swamp. Grace looked toward the window. "Not again." Dean stood. "I'm checking the generator." Before anyone could stop him, something tapped gently on the kitchen window. Not a knock, a fingernail. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Dean froze. The scratching moved slowly across the glass, as if someone outside were dragging one long finger from one side of the window to the other. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then the scratching stopped. A moment later, a child's voice whispered from the darkness beyond the glass. "Can I come in?" Grace's coffee mug slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. The voice came again, sweet, patient, so cold. Lightning flashed. For less than a heartbeat, the entire swamp lit up. Standing just beyond the porch, waist deep in the black water, were 6 human-shaped silhouettes, completely motionless, watching the cabin. The lightning vanished. Darkness swallowed them. Dean whispered, "Tell me you all saw that." No one answered, because we had. And none of us wanted to admit it. People always say daylight makes things less frightening. It doesn't. Darkness lets your imagination invent monsters. Morning lets you see where they were standing. None of us slept after the figures appeared outside the cabin. By dawn, the storm had passed. Gray morning light filtered through towering cypress trees, turning the fog silver as it drifted over the black water. The swamp looked deceptively peaceful. Dragonflies skimmed across stagnant pools. A pair of turtles slid from a fallen log into the water with quiet splashes. For a few moments, everything looked ordinary, almost beautiful. That illusion lasted until Dean opened the front door. The mud beneath the porch was covered in footprints, hundreds of them. Nobody spoke. The prints surrounded the cabin in every direction, overlapping one another until the ground looked churned by livestock. Bare feet, some adult-sized, some as small as children, some impossibly long and narrow. Every single set stopped exactly 6 feet from the porch. Not one footprint stepped onto the wooden boards. Dean slowly counted under his breath. Jesus. Grace crouched near the edge of the dock. They were here all night. I noticed something stranger. There were no tracks leading toward the cabins, only tracks leading away, as if every one of them had simply appeared during the night, stood watching us, then walked back into the swamp together before sunrise. Elias refused to let anyone follow them. "We finished today's survey." Dean stared at him. "Are you serious? If we're leaving, we need the boats." "We have the boats." The old guide slowly shook his head. "We got boats." He pointed toward our navigation equipment. "We don't know where we are." He wasn't wrong. During breakfast, I powered up our primary GPS receiver. Instead of displaying coordinates, the screen flashed the same error repeatedly. "Position unknown." I restarted it. Same message. Grace checked hers. Nothing. Dean unfolded our paper map across the kitchen table. His face tightened. "This isn't right." "What?" He pointed toward our camp. "We're supposed to be here." His finger tapped a location beside an old logging road. But according to yesterday's data, he traced another line. "We're almost 2 miles east." I frowned. "That's impossible. We never moved camp." "No." Dean looked out the window toward the swamp. But according to our equipment, he swallowed. The swamp did. By 8 o'clock, we headed back into the preserve. Nobody wanted to. Nobody argued either. The nearest rescue station lay nearly 40 miles away through waterways none of us trusted anymore. Our best chance was completing the survey route until we reached the extraction point scheduled for Friday morning. At least, that was the plan we kept repeating. Plans make people feel safer. Reality rarely cares. Morning sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy. Even during the brightest part of the day, the swamp remained cloaked in dim green shadows. Towering cypress trunks rose from black water like the pillars of some forgotten cathedral. Spanish moss hung in curtains thick enough to hide entire sections of forest. The deeper we walked, the stranger the silence became. There were insects, plenty of them, but almost nothing else. No bird calls, no squirrels, no raccoons, no deer, no alligator slides along muddy banks. An entire ecosystem felt absent. Grace stopped beside a shallow pool. "Look." Tiny fish floated upside down along the surface. Every one of them, dead. There wasn't a visible wound on any of them. Dean poked one gently with a survey rod. Fresh. It couldn't have been dead more than an hour. Nearby, 3 turtles lay half buried in the mud. Dead too, their shells completely intact. Grace whispered, "This shouldn't happen." Around noon, we reached our first survey marker, or rather, where the marker should have been. The metal stake we'd driven into the ground yesterday was gone. Not bent, not uprooted, gone. The bright orange flag tied around it had disappeared too. Dean searched the area carefully. "I know exactly where we left it." I did too. We spread out in widening circles. Nothing. No stake, no flag, no tool marks, no footprints. just untouched mud. Grace called from farther ahead. I found something. We hurried over. Half hidden beneath vines stood a weathered wooden sign. The lettering had almost completely faded beneath decades of mildew. Dean brushed away moss. The words slowly appeared. Camp Cypress, below it, smaller letters. Employees only. I unfolded the state survey map. Nothing, no logging camp, no structures, no roads. According to every official document, this place had never existed. Beyond the sign, a narrow trail disappeared into dense reeds. Fresh footprints covered the mud, boot prints, human, recent. Dean smiled for the first time all day. Finally, Grace looked uncertain. You think someone lives out here? Someone's been here. He pointed downward. Within a day. The trail wound deeper into the swamp. After nearly 15 minutes, the trees suddenly opened into a clearing. All four of us stopped. An entire village stood before us. Not houses, cabins, dozens of them. Weathered, sagging, some partially collapsed. Others looked almost intact. Raised walkways connected building after building across black water. Rusted fan boats rested beside old docks. Fishing nets still hung drying from wooden poles. Laundry fluttered gently on one clothesline. Fresh laundry. My heartbeat quickened. Someone had to be here. Dean called out, "Hello?" Only echoes answered. The place felt wrong, not abandoned. Paused. A cup of coffee sat on one porch, cold, untouched. A rocking chair moved slowly back and forth. No wind, a lantern burned inside one cabin despite daylight. The flame remained perfectly steady. Grace whispered, "I don't like this." Neither did I. Something about the silence felt rehearsed, like the village was pretending to be empty. We entered the largest cabin. Dust coated everything, but only above waist level. The floor looked clean, as if someone regularly walked through. Family photographs still lined shelves. Children, fishing trips, Christmas dinners, weddings, normal lives, until Dean noticed the calendar hanging beside the kitchen door. Its pages had yellowed with age. The month displayed. August 1987. Nothing after that. Grace quietly asked, "What happened here?" No one answered. I wandered into what had once been a bedroom. A small wooden dresser leaned against one wall. On top sat a framed photograph. A family of 5 smiling on a dock. Mother, father, 3 young boys. Something about the father seemed familiar. I leaned closer. My stomach tightened. It wasn't familiarity. It was resemblance. The man looked almost identical to Elias, 40 years younger. Same eyes, same crooked nose, same weathered face. I carried the picture into the main room. Elias. The old guy took one look at it. Every bit of color drained from his face. He whispered 2 words. "My brother." Silence. Dean looked back and forth between them. "You told us he died." I thought. Elias struggled to breathe. I thought he did. He slowly reached toward the photograph with trembling fingers, then froze. Written across the back of the frame, in fresh black ink, were 3 words. We never left. None of us had turned the picture over. None of us had written on it. The ink was still wet. A single drop slid slowly down the wood. Grace backed away from the table. "Marcus." I was already looking toward the doorway. Someone had walked across the porch. Not quickly, not hiding, just one slow set of footsteps. The boards creaked, then stopped. Dean rushed outside. Nothing. The boardwalk stretched empty in both directions. No movement, no boats, no people, just fog. Then, from somewhere deep inside the village, came the sound of a dinner bell. One slow ring, another, then another, echoing through dozens of empty cabins, as if someone was calling everyone home. Elias whispered, barely loud enough for us to hear, "They're awake." And somewhere beyond the fog, a door slowly creaked open. The bell echoed through the abandoned settlement. Once, twice, 3 slow, hollow rings. The sound rolled through the cypress trees before fading into the fog. Then, everything became quiet again. Not natural quiet. Expectant quiet, like the entire swamp had stopped breathing. Dean instinctively rested one hand on the hunting knife clipped to his belt. "Who's ringing that?" Nobody answered, because none of us wanted to admit the obvious. There wasn't supposed to be anyone here. Elias looked older than he had an hour earlier. He hadn't taken his eyes off the family photograph. His weathered hands trembled as he traced his younger brother's face with one finger. "My God." Grace spoke carefully. "You never told us you had family living out here." I didn't. His voice cracked. They left after the logging company shut down. He looked around the cabin. Or, I thought they did. Dean frowned. Maybe they stayed. Elias slowly shook his head. No, my brother wrote me. When? 88. What did he say? He said they were moving north. The old man swallowed hard. I buried his wife 10 years later. Silence settled over the room. Grace quietly asked, Then how is this photograph here? No one had an answer. The village stretched farther than we'd realized. As we cautiously followed the elevated boardwalks, more buildings emerged from the fog. Cabins, smokehouses, boat sheds, a church with a sagging white steeple, a one-room schoolhouse, an old general store with faded advertisements painted on warped wooden siding. Every building looked abandoned, yet none of them looked forgotten. The windows were clean, the doors hung straight. Even flower boxes beneath several windows still contained soil. Dead flowers, but recent soil, as if someone had tended them not long ago. The general store unnerved me the most. A brass bell jingled softly as Dean pushed open the door. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Shelves remained stocked with ancient canned goods, flour sacks hardened into stone, rusted coffee tins, faded bottles of medicine, and children's toys. A hand-painted sign still advertised gasoline for 98 cents. Behind the register sat an old ledger. Dean opened it. Most entries dated back to 1987. Orders for bait, flour, diesel fuel, fishing hooks. Then, one final page. The handwriting looked newer, much newer. There were only 4 entries. April 11th, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, 4 more coming soon. Dean stared at it. This isn't possible. Grace slowly turned the page. Blank, nothing else. Just those 4 words. 4 more coming soon. My stomach tightened. There were exactly 4 of us. Outside, something splashed. Not close. Maybe 100 yards away. Then another splash. Then another. Not random. Rhythmic. Like several people walking through shallow water at exactly the same pace. Dean stepped onto the porch. The fog had thickened considerably. Visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet. The village disappeared into shifting white curtains. Anybody see anything? Grace shook her head. No. Elias whispered, They're staying just outside sight. Dean looked irritated. You keep saying, they. The old man met his eyes. Because there ain't just one. We continued toward the church. Its white paint had peeled away decades earlier, leaving gray, weathered wood beneath. The front door stood slightly open. One hinge squealed softly whenever the breeze shifted. Inside, wooden pews faced a simple pulpit. Sunlight filtered through cracked stained glass windows, scattering faded colors across the floor. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then Grace stopped walking. There. Every pew contained scratches. Not random scratches. Names. Hundreds of names carved into the wood. Children, adults, entire families. Some dated as early as 1951. Others had no dates. Near the altar stood a much larger carving. The water remembers. Someone had tried to gouge the words away with an axe. They remained readable anyway. Dean wandered into a side room. A moment later he called, You need to see this. The room had once been used for storage. Shelves lined every wall. Most had collapsed. One remained standing, covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Every resident of the village appeared somewhere among them. Birthday parties, church picnics, fishing tournaments, school plays, wedding receptions, ordinary lives, until you looked carefully. In every single photograph, someone extra appeared, always in the background, standing near trees, watching from boats, half hidden behind buildings. The same tall figure, too far away to identify, too blurry to examine, yet unmistakably present. Grace picked up one picture. A family posed beside a freshly caught catfish. Behind them, waist deep in the swamp, stood the figure. Dean checked another. Same thing. School children outside the church. There it was again, far beyond the playground, watching. We searched photograph after photograph. It appeared in all of them, no exceptions. Elias whispered, It was always here. The room suddenly felt colder, not dramatically, just enough that I could see goosebumps spreading across Grace's arms. Dean rubbed the back of his neck. You guys hear that? At first, nothing. Then, very faintly, came laughter. Children laughing, somewhere outside. Grace smiled nervously. Please tell me that's birds. We all knew it wasn't. The laughter drifted between the cabins, sometimes close, sometimes distant, never stopping. Then it changed. One child's laugh became two, then six, then dozens. None of them sounded happy anymore. The laughter slowed, stretching into something that sounded disturbingly like crying. Dean pushed open the church doors. The laughter stopped instantly. The village stood empty, motionless. Fog rolled silently between the buildings. A weather vane creaked somewhere overhead. Nothing else moved. Then, one cabin door closed, slowly. No wind, just cree-ee, click, another. Across the village, cree-ee, click, another, then another, then another. Every cabin, one by one, doors closing throughout the settlement. None of us spoke. The sound continued for nearly a full minute, until the entire village had shut itself. Grace grabbed my sleeve. Marcus, I followed her gaze. Fresh footprints, bare feet, appearing one at a time in the muddy boardwalk ahead, not walking toward us, appearing, as if invisible feet were pressing into wet wood. One print, another, another. They stopped 10 feet away, facing us. Dean slowly raised his flashlight despite the daylight. The beam illuminated nothing, only empty air. Elias quietly backed away. Don't stand where they're standing, Dean whispered. Standing? The old guide nodded. They don't always let you see them. The smell arrived without warning. Rotting fish, wet earth, something metallic, blood. The odor grew stronger every second. Grace gagged. I can't. She covered her mouth. Dean looked toward the church entrance. The smell seemed to be coming from inside. We hadn't noticed it before. Carefully, we stepped back through the doorway. Everything looked exactly as we'd left it. Pews, pulpit, photographs, dust. Then I noticed something. The first pew. It hadn't been empty anymore. A hymn book rested neatly on the seat. Brand new, dry. Its cover looked untouched by time. Dean slowly opened it. Every page was blank, except the last. Written neatly in black ink were 5 names: Dean, Grace, Elias, Marcus. The 5th line hadn't been finished. Only one letter had been written. Elias inhaled sharply. My brother. Before he could finish, the church bell rang, not outside, directly above us. One deafening clang that shook dust from the rafters. Then another, then another. The whole building trembled. Outside, dozens of footsteps began running across the boardwalks. Not one person. Many, fast, circling the church, always just beyond the windows, always hidden by the fog. Dean backed toward the door. We're leaving. No one argued, but as we stepped onto the porch, every path leading back toward camp had disappeared beneath a wall of white fog so thick we couldn't even see the next cabin. The village was gone, swallowed, and from somewhere inside that endless white silence, a familiar voice called gently, Daddy. It was Emma, my 8-year-old daughter, hundreds of miles away, at home. She sounded frightened. Daddy? My blood ran cold, because she said the one thing only she would ever say to me. You forgot my dinosaur. Every parent knows their child's voice, even in a crowded room, even over a bad phone connection, even whispered from another floor of the house. Your brain recognizes it before you consciously do. That's why mine betrayed me. Daddy. The voice floated gently through the fog, scared, small, 8 years old, exactly as I remembered it. You forgot my dinosaur. Every muscle in my body locked. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Emma was home. She was nearly 300 miles away. I knew that. I knew it with absolute certainty. Yet hearing her voice cracked something deep inside me that logic couldn't reach. My daughter had always hidden a little green plastic triceratops in my backpack before every work trip. Every single one. She'd smile and say, so you won't be lonely. The creature, or whatever lived in this swamp, shouldn't have known that. I had never mentioned it. Not to Dean, not to Grace, not to Elias, no one. The voice came again, closer, Daddy. I actually took one step toward it, just one. Then a hand slammed into my chest. Elias. His weathered face had gone ghost white. Don't. I looked at him, barely hearing. That's my daughter. No. It knows she's your daughter. The distinction hit me like ice water. Not is. Knows. Grace grabbed my arm. Marcus. I looked at her. She was crying. Not from fear, from helplessness. She knew exactly what I wanted to believe. Dean quietly said, if it can copy us. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The voice drifted between the cabins. I'm scared. A pause. Daddy. Another pause. Please come. It sounded closer now, maybe 20 feet away, then 15, then 10, without ever producing footsteps, without disturbing the water, without moving the fog. It simply became closer. Dean suddenly shouted into the mist, "If you're real," he swallowed. "Tell me your birthday." Silence. Then Emma laughed, not a child's carefree laugh. A perfect imitation of one, almost correct, missing something, like a person who had studied happiness without ever experiencing it. Then she answered, "I don't remember." The voice immediately changed. Now it was my wife, Melissa, soft, warm, exactly the way she sounded whenever she'd wake me for work before sunrise. "Marcus, you've been gone long enough." Grace covered both ears. "No." The voice changed again, her own. "Dean," then Dean's. "I'm over here," then Elias. "Wrong way." Each sentence flawless, each delivered from a different direction. The fog had become full of people who didn't exist. The church bell rang once. The voices stopped immediately. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Then, every cabin door in the village opened, at exactly the same time. Creak! Dozens of weathered doors slowly swinging inward. Every building, every porch, every dark doorway, open, waiting. Dean whispered, "We need to leave." No argument. I turned toward where the main boardwalk should have been. It wasn't there. The village had changed. Cabins now stood where empty ground had been only minutes earlier. Walkways curved in different directions. The general store had vanished. The church seemed farther away. Grace looked around in disbelief. "This isn't the same place." Dean pulled the folded map from his pocket, his face drained of color. The paper wasn't a map anymore. Every contour line, every survey marker, every coordinate had disappeared. In their place was a detailed drawing of the village, each cabin carefully illustrated. At the very center, someone had drawn 4 small stick figures, standing inside the church. Us. Nobody spoke. Dean slowly turned the paper over. On the back, fresh pencil marks continued moving. We watched them, actually watched them. Lines slowly appeared by themselves, like an invisible hand was sketching. A 5th figure emerged near the edge of the page, tall, watching us. Then, one word wrote itself beneath the drawing. Found. Dean dropped the map. Something heavy splashed behind the church. Then another splash, then another. Not random, measured, like several large people stepping through waist-deep water. One after another, after another. The footsteps never hurried. They didn't need to. Elias raised his shotgun. "This way." He led us behind the church toward what looked like an old cemetery. Most of the wooden grave markers had long since rotted away. Only a handful remained standing. Grace stopped beside the first readable one. The inscription had almost disappeared. Elijah Thibodeau, 1954 to 1983. Grace looked toward Elias. His face became completely expressionless. "My brother," but she looked back at the family photograph she still carried. The picture. Elias slowly knelt beside the grave. "My brother never left this swamp." He brushed moss away from another marker, then another. Dean read the names aloud. Marie Thibodeau, Lucas Thibodeau, Anna Thibodeau. Every member of the family from the photograph. Buried, all in 1983. The dates matched. The graves were real. The photograph shouldn't have existed. A strange sound drifted through the cemetery. Not voices. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Dozens of breaths. All around us. The fog between the gravestones seemed thicker than everywhere else. Grace slowly turned in a circle. "Do you hear that?" I nodded. Dean whispered, "It's surrounding us." Then one gravestone tipped over, not violently, slowly, as though someone beneath it had leaned against it. The wet earth shifted. Mud rolled down into the hole. Nobody moved. Another grave sank, then another, then another. The entire cemetery began settling. The ground made soft sucking noises as trapped water bubbled upward. Grace stared in horror. "Marcus?" Something pale appeared beneath the collapsing soil. At first I thought it was exposed wood. Then I realized it was a hand, human, gray, perfectly preserved. Its fingers slowly curled around the edge of the broken grave marker. Dean stepped backward. "Run!" Nobody argued. We sprinted through the fog. Boardwalks groaned beneath our boots. Behind us, wood cracked, water splashed. Something climbed free. Not quickly, patiently, as though it had all the time in the world. The fog swallowed everything behind us, but we could hear it. Walking, not chasing, following. Every footstep perfectly matched one of ours. 4 of us running, 4 sets of footsteps behind us. Then, 5. Dean glanced over his shoulder. I heard another one. So did I. Grace stumbled. I caught her before she fell through a gap in the rotting boards. The swamp below looked almost black. Something moved beneath the surface. Huge. Long enough to pass beneath the boardwalk without revealing its full body. The water bulged upward as it glided underneath us, then disappeared. Ahead, the fog suddenly broke. Our camp. The 3 cabins stood exactly where we'd left them. The airboat rested beside the dock. Relief flooded through me. We made it. Elias didn't slow down. Not yet. He pointed toward the dock. My relief vanished instantly. Our airboat was no longer alone. Another identical boat floated beside it. Same dents, same registration numbers, same fuel cans, same equipment, an exact duplicate. And standing beside the second boat were 4 people, watching us. Me, Dean, Grace, Elias, perfect copies. None of them moved. None of them smiled. They simply waited, as if trying to decide which version belonged there. For a few seconds, none of us moved. The 4 people standing beside the second airboat didn't move either. They simply watched. They stood exactly where we stood. Dean's copy rested one hand on a survey pole. Grace's copy held binoculars around her neck. Elias's copy leaned on a shotgun. My copy held Emma's little green dinosaur in one hand, the tiny plastic triceratops. It slowly turned it over in its fingers, then looked directly at me. My stomach dropped. I'd left the toy inside my backpack, inside the cabin. Dean whispered, "Tell me that's not real." Nobody answered, because if it wasn't real, we were all seeing the same hallucination. That somehow felt even worse. The copies weren't grotesque. They weren't covered in blood or twisted into impossible shapes. They were normal, too normal. Every wrinkle, every stain on our clothes, every scratch on our boots. Even Dean's wedding ring, which he'd stopped wearing months earlier, but still kept hanging from a chain beneath his shirt. His copy wore it, exactly where it belonged. Grace quietly asked, "How did they know all that?" Elias answered without looking away. "They've been watching." The silence stretched. Then my copy smiled. It wasn't threatening. It looked sympathetic, like someone greeting an old friend. It carefully placed the toy dinosaur into its shirt pocket, exactly where I'd kept it during yesterday's hike. Then it spoke, in my voice. "We've been waiting." My blood froze. The tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't distorted. It sounded exactly like me after a long day at work. Tired, calm, matter of fact. Dean's copy spoke next. "You don't belong here anymore." Grace's copy finished the sentence. "But we do." The real Dean raised his knife. "What the hell are you?" The copies looked at one another, almost confused, like the question genuinely puzzled them. Finally, Elias' copy answered, "We are what stayed." A low vibration rolled beneath our feet. The boardwalk trembled. The water around both boats rippled outward in perfect circles. Not from wind, from below. Something enormous was moving underneath the dock. The copies all looked down simultaneously, then back at us. Without another word, they stepped backward, into the black water. Not splashing, not sinking. The swamp simply accepted them. Within seconds, they were gone. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Dean forced himself to move. He hurried toward the dock. The boats. We followed. There was only one. The duplicate had disappeared. The second fuel tank. The second equipment cases. Gone. The dock looked exactly as it had before. Dean turned slowly toward us. "You all saw—" Grace interrupted. "Don't. I need to know. I saw them." "So did I." Elias quietly nodded. "I told y'all." He looked out over the water. "It ain't trying to kill us." Dean stared at him. "It isn't?" "No." The old guide's expression became even more troubled. "It wants us to stay." Back inside the cabin, nobody touched lunch. The room smelled faintly of diesel fuel and damp wood. Rainwater dripped steadily from our jackets onto the floor. Dean spread every map we had across the kitchen table. None of them matched. The official state map showed waterways that no longer existed. Our GPS printouts displayed impossible coordinates. One map, one I had personally marked the previous afternoon, had changed completely. The survey lines now formed a spiral. Every route we'd walked circled inward, toward one point, the abandoned village. Grace stared at it. "We've been walking in circles." Dean shook his head. No. He tapped the page. We've been LED. That single word hung in the room. Led, not lost, guided, every broken trail, every missing marker, every failed GPS signal. It suddenly fit together. The swamp hadn't trapped us. Something inside it had been steering us, like fishermen herding fish into a net. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Everyone froze. One knock, not three. Different, human. Dean slowly approached the window. Outside stood a man, late 50s, heavy-set, gray beard, orange life vest. A weathered aluminum fishing boat floated behind him. He looked exhausted, relieved to see us. Oh, thank God, his voice cracked. I've been trying to find somebody all morning. Dean looked back at us. A survivor? Grace frowned. How? The man waved. My motor died. Can y'all help me? Everything about him looked ordinary. His boat carried fishing rods, coolers, a tackle box, even a South Carolina Gamecock sticker peeling from the hull. He looked exactly like 100 fishermen I'd seen growing up. Dean opened the door. Elias grabbed him so violently the younger man nearly fell. No, Dean jerked away. There's an actual person out there. Elias whispered, watch. The fisherman smiled warmly. You folks all right? Dean called back. Where'd you come from? The man pointed vaguely behind himself. Been fishing all morning. What lake? The smile remained. He blinked once. This one. Dean frowned. This isn't a lake. The man didn't answer. Instead, he asked another question. Y'all been here long? Nobody responded. His smile widened slightly. You'll like it. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt colder. Grace leaned toward me. Marcus. I nodded. The man hadn't blinked again. Not once. Dean tried another question. What's today's date? The fisherman tilted his head. His smile remained frozen. Thursday. What date? A long pause. Thursday. Dean slowly stepped away from the door. The man outside laughed quietly. Then, without warning, he called me by name. Marcus. Every hair on my body stood up. We found your little dinosaur. Nobody remembered closing the curtains. One moment the windows were open. The next, every curtain in the cabin had been drawn shut. The room became dim. Someone whispered. It wasn't any of us. I wouldn't look. The voice came from upstairs. There was no upstairs. Every head slowly lifted toward the ceiling. A soft creak drifted across the roof. Then another. Footsteps. Walking. Directly above us. Slow. Measured. One end of the cabin to the other. Back again. The roof was pitched at a steep angle. No one could have walked on it. The footsteps stopped directly over the kitchen. Dust drifted down through the ceiling boards. Then, 3 soft knocks echoed from directly overhead. Tap, tap, tap. No one moved. Outside, the fisherman began whistling a tune, the same lullaby Melissa used to sing Emma to sleep. I had never told anyone that melody. Not Dean, not Grace, not Elias, not another living soul. The whistling continued, slow, perfect, patient, as if whoever stood outside had listened to our lives for far longer than we'd been in the swamp. And somewhere beneath the cabin, something large bumped gently against the stilts. Once, twice, then a third time. The whole floor shivered. Elias quietly chambered a shell into his shotgun. They know us now. The lights flickered, went out, and for the first time since entering Black Cypress Preserve, something began climbing the outside wall of the cabin. The first thing that climbed onto the roof wasn't heavy. It sounded almost cautious. A slow scrape, then another, like bare skin sliding across old tin. The lights had gone out completely now, leaving us with only our flashlights and the gray afternoon filtering through the cracks around the boarded windows. Nobody spoke. The scraping continued. It moved from one end of the cabin to the other with deliberate slowness, not pacing, searching. The old boards above us groaned. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Grace instinctively stepped away from the center of the room. Dean tightened his grip on the hunting knife clipped to his belt. I swear to God. Elias slowly shook his head. No. You don't swear in here. Dean stared at him. Now's when religion matters. The old guide never looked away from the ceiling. No. His voice was barely audible. They like promises. The scratching stopped directly above us. Silence settled over the cabin. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the roof. Somewhere beneath the floor, black water lapped gently against the stilts. Then a child's laughter drifted across the ceiling, not outside, inside the attic. Only there wasn't an attic. The cabin had been built directly beneath the roof. There wasn't enough space above us for anyone to crawl. The laughter moved from one end of the room to the other anyway. Dean whispered, "Marcus." "I know." The laughter stopped. Then someone whispered through the ceiling boards. So close. It was my own voice. Without warning, thud. Something landed on the porch outside. The impact shook the entire cabin. Another thud followed, then another, heavy, wet, one after another, like bodies dropping from the trees. Grace looked toward the window. What was that? Nobody answered, because none of us wanted to know. Dean slowly peeled back the corner of the curtain, only an inch, just enough to look outside. He immediately let it fall shut again. His face had turned completely white. "What?" He didn't answer. "Dean," he swallowed. "They're standing on the porch." "Who?" "S." Silence. Every heartbeat suddenly felt deafening. Dean finally whispered, "They're not moving." I walked beside him, carefully, slowly. I lifted the curtain myself. 4 figures stood on the porch, exactly where we'd been standing moments earlier. My copy still had Emma's dinosaur tucked into its shirt pocket. Grace's copy tilted its head slightly. Dean's copy rested both hands casually in its pockets. Elias was smiling now, not a wide grin, just enough. Like it knew something we didn't. None of them blinked. Rain poured over them. Their clothes never became wet. Then every copy looked directly at the window, at exactly the same time. My copy slowly raised one finger. It pointed, not at me, at the ceiling. A second later, something above us took one more step. The entire roof bowed inward. Wood cracked. Dust exploded downward. Elias shouted, "Out the back!" Dean kicked open the rear door. We poured onto the narrow boardwalk behind the cabin. The swamp greeted us with thick humidity and the overwhelming smell of algae and rotten wood. The air had become strangely still. No insects, no birds, even the frogs had gone silent. Behind us, the cabin roof collapsed, not completely, just enough for something enormous to force itself inside. Wood splintered, glass shattered, the walls trembled. But whatever entered never made a sound. We didn't stop running. The boardwalk twisted through flooded cypress groves before opening onto a stretch of shallow marsh. The water barely reached our knees. Mud sucked at every step. Spanish moss brushed our faces like cold fingers. Branches scraped against our shoulders. Grace slipped once. Dean hauled her upright before she disappeared into the muck. No one looked back. We all knew something followed us, not because we heard it, because the swamp behind us had stopped making echoes. After nearly 10 minutes, Elias suddenly stopped. His hand shot into the air. Everyone froze. Ahead, the marsh opened into a broad stretch of black water, perfectly still, no ripples, no insects touching the surface, nothing. An old ferry dock stretched into the center of the flooded basin, half collapsed, weathered gray. A single lantern hung from one post, burning. Dean frowned. "Who's keeping that lit?" Elias answered quietly. "No one." The lantern shouldn't have been burning. Its glass chimney was spotless. The brass looked polished. Fresh oil glowed inside. Everything else around it had rotted decades ago. Grace noticed something floating beneath the dock. "What is that?" At first I thought they were logs. Then one slowly rolled over. Human faces, dozens, floating just beneath the surface, eyes open, hair drifting lazily through the water. They weren't moving, they weren't decomposing. They simply watched upward, as if waiting for someone to step onto the dock. Dean took one involuntary step backward. The nearest face smiled. The water rippled. Every floating face slowly sank beneath the surface, one after another, without splashing, without blinking. The black water became smooth again. Then, a boat appeared. No sound, no engine. It simply drifted out of the fog. An old wooden skiff, paint peeling from its sides. One oar rested across the seats. No one rowed it, no current pushed it, yet it glided directly toward the dock. Grace whispered, "Where did that come from?" Elias looked terrified. It finally sent one. The boat bumped gently against the dock. A soft knock echoed through the stillness. One tap against old wood, then another. 3 taps, exactly 3. Dean stared at Elias. "What is it?" The old guide's breathing had become shallow. "My grandfather told me," he whispered, "never get in the second boat." Dean frowned. "What second boat?" Elias slowly pointed across the water. We all turned. Another skiff had appeared, identical. Same peeling paint, same single oar, same gentle rocking, except someone sat inside. The figure wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over its face. Hands folded neatly in its lap, motionless, waiting. The distance between us made details impossible to see. Then the figure slowly lifted its head. Even from nearly 100 yards away, I recognized the face. It was mine. The copy smiled. Then, in a voice that somehow carried effortlessly across the still water, it called out, "Marcus." The sound echoed once, softly, not through the air, through the swamp itself. Then it said something that stopped my heart. "It isn't your daughter anymore." Grace looked at me. I couldn't move. My copy stood, stepped out of the boat, and walked across the surface of the black water toward us. Not sinking, not running, walking, as though the swamp itself had decided to hold its weight. Behind it, the water began filling with more figures, hundreds of pale faces slowly rising from beneath the surface, watching, waiting, smiling, and somewhere behind us, hidden among the cypress trees, came the unmistakable sound of the cabin door slowly creaking open again, even though we'd left it nearly a mile behind. I don't remember deciding to run. One second I was staring at my own face walking across the water. The next, Dean had grabbed the back of my vest and yanked me hard enough that I fell into the mud. My copy never stopped smiling. It wasn't a predator's grin. It wasn't cruel. It looked relieved, like it had finally caught up to someone it had been searching for. It took another step across the surface of the swamp. No ripples spread beneath its boots. The black water hardened beneath every footfall. Grace whispered beside me, "How?" Nobody answered, because there wasn't an answer. Then the other faces began rising, not climbing, floating, heads first, shoulders, then torsos. Dozens of pale figures emerged silently from beneath the surface until they stood waist deep in the water surrounding the dock. Men, women, children, old people, young couples, hunters, fishermen, loggers. Every one of them stared directly at us. None blinked, none breathed. Their clothes looked decades out of fashion. Some wore suspenders, some old military jackets. One little girl still clutched a faded rag doll against her chest. Water streamed endlessly from their clothing, yet the surface around them remained perfectly still. Dean slowly backed away from the dock. "Marcus," I couldn't stop looking. My copy reached into its shirt pocket. Carefully, slowly, it removed Emma's dinosaur, the tiny green triceratops. It held the toy up between two fingers. Then, with incredible gentleness, it set the dinosaur on the water. The toy floated toward us, not drifting randomly, moving in a perfectly straight line. Like someone beneath the surface pushed it gently through the swamp. Grace whispered, "It wants you." "No," Elias corrected. "It wants him to come." The dinosaur bumped softly against the dock. I stared at it. One of its horns had broken off years earlier after Emma dropped it on the kitchen floor. The tiny scratch near its tail, the faded paint across one eye, it wasn't similar. It was hers, the exact toy she'd hidden in my backpack. I slowly bent down. Dean grabbed my arm again. "Don't. My daughter. It knows that." His grip tightened. "It keeps using her because it's working." He was right. God help me. He was right. The copy stopped walking. It stood perhaps 15 feet from the dock, close enough now that I could see every detail of my own face, even the scar beneath my chin from a bicycle accident when I was 12. It spoke quietly. "You've been tired for a long time." No one reacted, because it wasn't talking to everyone. It was talking only to me. "You don't sleep anymore." It smiled sympathetically. "You still blame yourself." My chest tightened. No, nobody knew that, not even Melissa. Especially not Melissa. She thought I'd eventually accepted my father's death. I hadn't. I still replayed that phone call every few weeks. Still wondered whether visiting him one weekend earlier would have changed anything. I'd never spoken those thoughts aloud. Ever. My copy nodded gently. "As long as you remember," it said. "We remember." Behind it, the faces in the water slowly tilted their heads in perfect unison. Every single one. Exactly the same angle. Exactly the same speed. Grace let out a trembling breath. "Oh my God," Dean muttered. "It's connected to them." Elias quietly answered, "No." His eyes never left the water. "They're connected to IT." The swamp suddenly shivered. Not the water, the entire swamp. Trees creaked together. Spanish moss swayed, although there wasn't any wind. The ground beneath our boots vibrated faintly. Then, the lantern at the end of the dock went out. Instantly. Darkness swept across the basin. Only our flashlights remained. Their beams cut through the blackness. For just a heartbeat, they illuminated hundreds more figures standing silently among the cypress trees surrounding us. Not in the water, on land, watching. Far too many to count. Then the flashlights flickered, and they were gone. Something touched my boot. I looked down, the dinosaur. It had somehow reached my feet. No ripples, no sound. It was simply there. Dean slowly reached for it. The toy immediately slid backward 6 inches, on its own, away from him, toward me. Grace whispered, "It doesn't want anyone else touching it." My copy finally spoke again. Its voice had changed. Now, it sounded tired, ancient, older than the swamp itself. We tried to leave. The words echoed strangely, not through the air, through the water. We forgot ourselves. Another pause. Now, its smile faded. We remember everyone. Elias closed his eyes. No. The copy looked at him. You remember. It pointed toward the old guy. You just stopped listening. Without warning, Elias dropped to his knees. He cried out in pain. Both hands clutched the sides of his head. No. Grace rushed toward him. Elias. He shoved her away. His breathing had become ragged. His eyes stared into something none of us could see. "They're talking," he whispered. "So many." He screamed, not from fear, from grief. "I know your names," the swamp answered. Every figure standing in the water opened its mouth simultaneously. Not screaming, whispering, hundreds of whispers merged into one impossible sound. A language, old, almost musical. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Blood trickled from Elias's nose, then his ears. He kept shouting over the voices. "I didn't leave you." The whisper stopped. Absolute silence. Then one small voice floated across the basin. A little boy. "You promised." Elias collapsed. Dean and I dragged him backward through the mud while Grace kept looking over her shoulder. My copy never followed. It simply watched, patiently, like someone waiting for a train they knew would eventually arrive. As we retreated, it called after us. "Tomorrow." I froze. "What?" Its smile returned. "The boats leave tomorrow." Dean pulled me harder. "Marcus!" I stumbled after him. Behind us, my copy slowly sank beneath the surface, not downward. It simply became part of the water. The faces followed, one by one. The basin emptied. Within seconds, nothing remained except black water reflecting gray clouds, as though nothing had ever been there. We didn't stop until the cabins came into view. The generator was running again, even though we'd shut it off before leaving. Yellow light spilled from every window. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. For a brief, impossible moment, it looked welcoming, like home. Dean slowed. "Did anyone leave the lights on?" "No." Grace answered immediately. "No one." The front door stood open. Warm light poured across the porch. Inside, someone was moving. We could hear dishes clinking together, a chair scraping softly across the wooden floor. Someone humming. The same lullaby Melissa used to sing Emma. Dean whispered, "Who's in there?" No one answered, because we all knew. No matter who we found inside, it wouldn't be alone anymore. The porch boards groaned beneath our boots. Not loudly, just enough to remind us that they were old. Old enough to remember every person who had ever crossed them. Warm yellow light spilled through the open doorway, cutting a soft rectangle across the wet porch. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof behind us, but inside the cabin everything looked peaceful. A cast iron pot simmered on the stove. Coffee steamed from 4 enamel mugs arranged neatly on the kitchen table. 4 bowls sat beside them. Each one had a spoon. Each place setting faced an empty chair. Someone had even lit 2 oil lamps. The room smelled of venison stew, fresh biscuits, and chicory coffee. The smell hit me harder than any monster we'd seen. It smelled like my grandmother's kitchen, like Sunday evenings before life became complicated, before funerals, before regret. The swamp wasn't trying to scare us anymore. It was trying to comfort us. That terrified me far more. Dean stepped inside first. His knife remained in one hand. The other reached slowly toward one of the coffee mugs. Steam curled from its surface. Fresh. Someone had poured it only moments ago. Grace whispered, "There's no way." Elias didn't cross the doorway. He stood outside, staring into the surrounding trees instead. "They're inside already." Dean looked around the empty room. "I don't see anybody." "You won't." The cabin looked cleaner than we'd left it that morning. Much cleaner. The muddy footprints we'd tracked across the floor were gone. The shattered coffee mug Grace had dropped the previous night had somehow been swept away. Our damp jackets hung neatly from wall hooks. Boots sat side by side near the door. Someone had folded the blankets, made the beds, even my backpack had been zipped shut. It looked like we'd returned to a home after a long day's work, not a nightmare. Grace slowly approached the kitchen table. There are 4 bowls. Dean frowned. There are 4 of us. She shook her head. No, she pointed. There are 5. He looked again. She was right. One smaller bowl sat at the far end of the table, child-sized. Beside it rested a tiny spoon. Nobody moved. The humming stopped. It came from somewhere deeper inside the cabin, the bedroom. A floorboard creaked. One slow step, then another. Someone was walking toward us. Dean raised his knife. I'm warning you. The footsteps stopped just beyond the bedroom doorway. We could see only darkness inside, nothing else. Then a woman's voice floated out, soft, gentle. Food's getting cold. Melissa, not close, not distorted, exactly Melissa. My knees almost buckled. Dean caught my shoulder. Marcus. I couldn't answer. My copy knew things, but this wasn't memory anymore. It knew how she spoke when she was relaxed. The little pause before she'd tease me, the way she'd soften the word food because she knew I'd skip meals while working. It wasn't repeating sounds, it understood them. The voice came again. You've all been through enough. Grace squeezed her eyes shut. No, you can stop running. Another pause. Just eat. A chair slowly slid away from the table. No one touched it. It stopped, waiting, inviting. Dean whispered, everybody back. Nobody moved. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. Warm butter, pepper, onions cooking in broth. It was the smell of safety, of home. My stomach growled before I could stop it. The swamp had waited until we were exhausted, hungry, cold. Then it offered exactly what we wanted. Elias finally stepped into the cabin. He walked directly to the stove. Without hesitation, he lifted the cast iron pot, walked outside, and dumped every drop into the swamp. The stew hit the black water with a loud splash. The smell vanished instantly, not faded, vanished, as though it had never existed. Inside the cabin, the pot was empty, bone dry. There hadn't been food in it at all. Grace stared in disbelief. But I smelled it. So did I. Elias quietly nodded. It lets you smell what you miss. Then the humming returned. Only, it wasn't coming from the bedroom anymore. It came from upstairs. Again. The cabin had no upstairs. Dean slowly looked toward the ceiling. The humming moved, crossing from one side of the roof to the other. Then another voice joined it, then another, then another. Within seconds, dozens of people were humming the same lullaby above our heads, perfectly in time, perfectly together, like a church choir, except every voice belonged to someone we loved. Grace broke first. She covered both ears. Stop. One voice rose above the others, her father's. He'd died 6 years earlier. Gracie. She froze. Her breathing became ragged. I know that voice. Dean grabbed her shoulders. Don't answer. But tears streamed down her face. It sounds exactly like him. I know. He called me Gracie. Dean's expression hardened. It wants you to believe that. The roof groaned. Something heavy shifted overhead. Not walking now. Crawling. Weight pressing against every rafter. Dust sifted down, then black water. Just a few drops. They landed on the kitchen table. Each drop spread outward against gravity, moving across the wood like living ink. The puddles joined together, forming words. We watched them appear. Stay until morning. The water continued moving. Then choose. Nobody spoke. Dean reached for a rag. Before he could wipe the words away, they slid off the edge of the table, dripped onto the floor, and disappeared between the floorboards. The radio crackled. We all jumped. It had been dead since our first night. Static hissed through the speaker. Then, a voice. Clear. Professional. Survey Team 7, this is Ranger Station Delta. Do you copy? Dean lunged for it. This is Team 7. Static. Then the ranger answered. We've been trying to reach you. Relief washed across every face. Dean nearly laughed. We're trapped out here. We need extraction immediately. A pause. Then, the ranger replied, You're already home. The radio went silent. Nobody moved. Finally, Grace whispered, What did he say? No one repeated it, because we all heard it. Night fell faster than it should have. 1 minute, gray light filtered through the windows. The next, the swamp outside had become pitch black. No sunset, no twilight, just darkness. The insects returned all at once, thousands of them. Their endless buzzing surrounded the cabin. Then they stopped, every single one. The silence that followed felt enormous, like standing at the bottom of the ocean. A single knock echoed from the front door. One knock, then another, then a third. Dean looked toward Elias. The old guide closed his eyes. They've come to count. The doorknob slowly began to turn. Not violently, but patiently, as if whoever stood outside believed they lived there. The latch clicked. The door opened an inch. Cold swamp air drifted inside. Then a voice, calm and familiar, spoke from the darkness. There's only one question left. It was my voice again. Which four of us are going home? No one answered the voice at the door. The question hung in the cabin. Which four of us are going home? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't threatening. It sounded like someone asking who wanted another cup of coffee, casual, patient, certain there would eventually be an answer. Dean slowly backed away from the entrance. The front door remained open 6 inches. Beyond it, there was only darkness. Not night. Darkness. Our flashlight beams died less than 3 feet beyond the threshold, swallowed by something thicker than fog. Nothing reflected back. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. It was like looking into an empty hole carved into the world. Then came footsteps, not approaching, walking away. 1 pair, then 2, then dozens. The porch groaned under impossible weight. The sounds drifted toward the dock, across the boardwalk, into the swamp. After nearly a minute, they faded. The darkness outside remained. Dean quietly shut the door. The latch clicked. Every oil lamp inside the cabin went out. Grace screamed. Something had touched her shoulder. Dean swung his flashlight toward her. Nothing. She spun in circles, breathing hard. I felt someone. Her voice shook violently. They leaned over me. Nobody's there. I know somebody touched me. She grabbed her own shoulder. There was a hand. I believed her, not because I saw it, because there were fresh, wet fingerprints soaking through the back of her shirt. 5 gray marks. Long fingers. Elias lit another lantern with shaking hands. The warm light barely reached the corners of the room. He looked older every hour. The deep lines across his face had become sharper. His hair looked whiter. Even his voice had changed. They're getting stronger. Dean looked at him. Why? The old guide stared at the lantern flame. Because we're remembering them. Nobody understood. He sighed. My grandfather wasn't warning us about monsters. What then? He said the swamp remembers every person who dies inside it. Grace frowned. That doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't. He rubbed both eyes. But he always said memory is heavier than flesh. He walked to the window. Outside, the darkness had become absolute. When enough people are forgotten, he continued, but the swamp remembers them instead. Dean stared. So what are we seeing? They ain't ghosts. They ain't demons. He looked back toward us. They're memories that forgot who they belonged to. Silence settled over the room. The explanation somehow made everything worse. Because memories don't die. Dean finally spoke. The village. Elias nodded. They stopped leaving. The people? The memories. Grace whispered, what happened to the real people? The old man didn't answer immediately. Finally, they walked out. And they weren't themselves anymore. The cabin suddenly creaked. A single board popped somewhere beneath the floor. Then another. The sound slowly traveled beneath us, moving. Something was crawling under the cabin. Not swimming, but crawling. Hands scraping across mud. Wood groaned beneath its weight. It stopped directly beneath the kitchen table. A slow knock came from below. 1 knock, then another, then another. 3, always 3. Dean quietly mouthed, don't answer. No one moved. Another 3 knocks echoed beneath us. Then, a little girl's voice drifted upward through the floorboards. So cold, Grace covered her mouth. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't anyone we knew. Just a frightened child. So hungry. The voice began crying softly. The sound was unbearable. Not loud, not dramatic, just exhausted. The kind of crying children do after they've completely run out of hope. Dean gritted his teeth. It's fake. I wasn't sure anymore. The crying stopped. A different voice replaced it. An elderly woman, weak, confused. Is somebody there? Another voice. A teenage boy. Please. Another. A man. They locked the door. The voices continued. Different ages, different accents, different decades. Hundreds of people, all speaking quietly beneath the cabin. Not screaming, not begging. Simply remembering their last moments. Elias slowly sank into a chair. I've heard them before. Dean looked at him. When? When I was 10, the room fell silent. My grandfather brought me here. Why? He wanted me to understand. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. We stayed one night. What happened? He made me promise. What promise? The old guide finally looked up. If the swamp ever learned my name, he whispered, I'd never tell it another. Dean frowned. What does that mean? Elias answered with another question. Have any of you told somebody your full name since we got here? None of us answered immediately. Then, my blood turned to ice. The first night, around the campfire, we'd introduced ourselves, full names, hometowns, families. Dean slowly looked around the room. We all did. Elias closed his eyes. I was afraid of that. The lantern flame suddenly stretched sideways towards the bedroom. Not from wind. The temperature dropped so fast our breath became visible. One by one, every family photograph hanging on the cabin wall tilted crooked. Not falling, turning, all of them, until every face and every picture stared toward the hallway. Something was standing there, just beyond the lantern's reach, too dark to see. Grace whispered, Who's there? No answer. The darkness simply shifted, like someone changing their weight from one foot to the other. Dean raised his flashlight. The beam reached the hallway. Nothing. Empty. He lowered it and the silhouette returned. Standing exactly where the light had been, watching, waiting. Then it stepped forward. 1 foot, another, into the lantern glow. It wasn't one of our copies. It wasn't human. Not completely. It looked assembled. Thousands of faces drifted slowly beneath skin that behaved like black water. Eyes opened and closed across its body. Mouths whispered names. Hands emerged from its shoulders, then dissolved again. Children, old women, hunters, mothers, soldiers, fishermen, all flowing together into one towering shape that barely fit inside the hallway. It had no stable face. Every few seconds another appeared. A little girl, an old man, a crying infant, then my father, then Emma, then me. Its voice sounded like hundreds speaking together, not loudly, simply, completely. We remember. The cabin trembled, the walls groaned, the lantern shattered, darkness swallowed the room, and from somewhere inside that living darkness, someone whispered one final sentence. We only need one of you to stay. Darkness has weight. I never believed that before Black Cypress. I thought darkness was simply the absence of light. I was wrong. When the lantern shattered, something heavy settled over the cabin. The air thickened until every breath felt like pulling water into my lungs. No one moved. No one even dared whisper. The thing in the hallway had stolen every sound. Then it breathed, not through lungs, through hundreds of mouths. A long, slow inhale filled the cabin. Every face drifting across its body inhaled at exactly the same time. Children, old men, young women, faces I had never seen. Faces I somehow recognized. Faces that vanished before I could remember where I'd known them. The sound reminded me of wind moving through a cemetery. Soft, patient, endless. Dean snapped on his flashlight. The beam hit the hallway. Nothing. Empty. The creature was gone. The light swept across peeling wallpaper. A broken chair, an old coat hanging beside the bedroom. Nothing else. Dean lowered the flashlight. Immediately, the whispering returned, behind us. We spun around. The creature now stood beside the front door. No footsteps, no movement. 1 second absent. The next, there. Its body rippled like reflections on black water. Faces surfaced through its skin before sinking again. One stopped. A young woman. She looked directly at Grace. Her lips trembled. Help me. Grace instinctively stepped forward. The face dissolved. Another replaced it. Her father. He smiled gently. Pumpkin. Grace gasped. Dean caught her arm before she could move again. Don't. Tears streamed down her face. He doesn't even call me Grace. I know. He always called me Pumpkin. The thing smiled, not with one mouth, with 50. It wasn't copying voices anymore. It was learning emotions, testing them, watching which ones hurt the most. The temperature kept dropping. Our breath drifted through the flashlight beams. Thin ice spread across the inside of the cabin windows. Outside, the swamp had become unnaturally quiet. Not a single frog, not one insect. Even the wind had disappeared. The world itself seemed to be listening. Then came another sound. Footsteps, hundreds of them, surrounding the cabin, slow, measured, never hurried. The porch groaned, boardwalks creaked, mud squished beneath bare feet, every direction, every side of the cabin. Dean quietly counted. 1, another footstep. 2, then he stopped counting. There were too many. A handprint appeared on the front window, from the outside, gray, wet, then another beside it, then another. Soon dozens of palms pressed against every pane of glass. Adults, children, tiny infant-sized prints, long skeletal fingers, all motionless, watching. Then they began tapping, not randomly, together, a slow rhythm, tap, 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 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. The entire cabin echoed with the impossible rhythm, thousands of fingers tapping in perfect synchronization. Elias stood, his knees shook. They're asking permission. Dean stared. Permission for what? The old guide answered without taking his eyes off the windows. To come home. The creature suddenly tilted every face upward, as if listening. Then all of its mouths spoke together. He is here. Nobody understood. He remembers. The thing slowly turned toward Elias. Every eye focused on the old guide. He looked defeated, not frightened, guilty, very guilty. Dean noticed. What aren't you telling us? Elias didn't answer. The creature did. He buried them. The cabin became silent. Dean frowned. What? The faces shifted. Now everyone belonged to Elias's younger brother. We drowned. Another face. We waited. Another. He closed the channel. Another. He left. Elias collapsed into a chair. I didn't have a choice. Dean looked between them. What channel? The old guide buried his face in both hands. The logging company. His voice barely rose above a whisper. They flooded this place. Nobody interrupted. They wanted to build the reservoir. He swallowed hard. They told everyone to evacuate. Grace stared. They didn't. Most did. His breathing became uneven. But some families stayed. The company couldn't delay construction. My chest tightened. So they flooded it anyway? Elias nodded. They told us everyone had already left. Silence. My brother wouldn't leave. The old man's eyes filled with tears. I knew that. You knew? I was one of the engineers. Nobody spoke. I signed the final paperwork. The words landed like stones. Everything suddenly made sense. The abandoned village, the drowned cemetery, the preserved faces beneath the water, the impossible memories. The swamp hadn't created them. People had, human beings. The reservoir hadn't swallowed empty wilderness. It had buried an entire community, and history had forgotten it. Everything except the swamp. The creature slowly approached Elias. It never walked. The floor simply darkened beneath it until it stood inches away. Thousands of whispering voices merged into one. You promised. Elias nodded weakly. I know. You said you'd come back. I know. You never did. I know. The old man began sobbing, not loudly, quietly, like someone whose grief had finally become too heavy to carry. Then something impossible happened. The creature reached out. One hand formed from dozens of overlapping hands. The old guide gasped. His entire body stiffened. His eyes rolled back. Images flashed across the cabin walls. Not projected, remembered. We saw children running across the old boardwalk, women hanging laundry, church services, fishing tournaments, birthday parties, people laughing, people living, then sirens, rain, water rushing through newly opened floodgates, screaming, families trapped inside cabins, boats overturning, children disappearing beneath black water, doors refusing to open against rising pressure, hands beating desperately against windows. The entire village drowning. The memories flooded around us until I couldn't tell whether I was watching them or living them. Grace screamed. Dean dropped to one knee. I couldn't breathe. Freezing water seemed to fill my lungs. Voices cried from every direction, hundreds, thousands, calling names, searching for children, begging for help. Then, silence. The memories vanished. The cabin returned. Only Elias had changed. His hair had become completely white. His face looked 20 years older. He opened his eyes slowly. They remembered everything. The creature nodded. So do you. Outside, the tapping stopped. The handprint slowly slid down every window, not disappearing, sinking, as if every wall of the cabin had suddenly become deep, black water. One by one, the hands vanished beneath the wood. Then the floorboards beneath us began to bulge upward. Water seeped through the cracks. Cold, black, rising. The creature looked at each of us in turn. Its voice no longer sounded threatening, only inevitable. The water is returning. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, an old church bell rang once, then again, and from the darkness of the flooded forest came the unmistakable roar of rushing water. The reservoir was filling again. The sound reached us before the water did. At first it was only a distant rumble, low, steady, like thunder trapped beneath the earth. The cabin trembled. Coffee mugs rattled across the kitchen table. The windows buzzed softly inside their frames. Then the rumble grew louder, much louder, until there could be no mistake. It wasn't thunder, it was moving water, an entire river coming straight toward us. Dean rushed to the window. He wiped away the condensation with his sleeve. Outside, the swamp was changing. The black water between the cypress trees had begun rising, not inch by inch, feet at a time. The current pushed entire tree trunks past the cabin. Broken docks, pieces of rooftops, dead branches. Everything swept through the flooded forest with terrifying speed. This isn't possible. Grace stood beside him. The storm? Dean shook his head immediately. No storm raises water this fast. Elias slowly stood. His legs barely held him. They're remembering the night. What? The flood. He looked out into the darkness. It's happening again. The cabin lurched violently. Something enormous slammed into the stilts beneath us. Wood cracked. One support beam snapped with a sharp report. The entire structure leaned several inches before settling again. Grace stumbled into the wall. Dust rained from the ceiling. Another impact followed. Harder. Then another. Dean grabbed the shotgun from beside Elias. What keeps hitting us? Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to look. I looked anyway, through the side window. Something floated against the cabin, not debris, a church pew, still upright, resting against the wall. As the current shifted, the pew slowly rolled over. Someone was sitting on it, an elderly woman, hands folded neatly in her lap, gray dress, white hair tied into a bun. Her eyes remained closed. The rushing water carried her gently past the cabin. Then another pew drifted by, a young mother holding an infant, still, silent. Then another, a teenage boy gripping a fishing pole, a little girl hugging a stuffed rabbit. None of them moved, none of them blinked. The current carried them past like forgotten passengers on a river that never reached the sea. Grace whispered, I finished the sentence. They're going home. Another crash. The front porch tore away from the cabin. We watched it disappear into the darkness. The boardwalk connecting us to the dock snapped apart moments later. Entire sections floated away. Within seconds, the cabin stood completely isolated, an island surrounded by rushing black water. Dean looked around the room. We can't stay here. Elias nodded. No, we were never supposed to. The creature still stood in the hallway. It hadn't moved. The countless faces drifting beneath its skin now watched the flood outside instead of us, almost reverently. One child's face surfaced. He couldn't have been older than 7. He quietly asked, "Do you hear them?" The room became silent. At first, nothing. Then, singing, very faint, carried across the floodwaters, an old church hymn, hundreds of voices, perfectly together. The drowned village was singing. Dean opened the back door, and cold wind rushed inside. The water had already climbed halfway up the cabin steps. We leave now. No one argued. The moment we stepped outside, the smell hit us. Fresh rain, river mud, rotting timber, and something else, fresh-cut pine, the exact smell of a logging camp. I turned slowly. The swamp was disappearing. The flooded forest around us had become a town. Not completely, pieces of it. The church stood where only trees had been minutes earlier. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Lanterns glowed in cabin windows. Children ran along boardwalks. Men unloaded fishing nets. Dogs barked. Women laughed while hanging laundry. The village wasn't abandoned anymore. It was alive, exactly as it had been before the flood. Dean stared in disbelief. Where, Grace finished, seeing the past. Nobody acknowledged us. The people walked through us as though we didn't exist. A fisherman carrying catfish nearly passed through Dean's shoulder without noticing. A woman balanced 2 buckets of water while humming softly. Children chased one another down muddy streets. Everything looked ordinary, beautiful, peaceful, until the church bell rang. One slow toll. The entire village stopped. Every conversation ended. Every child froze. Every face turned toward the northern tree line, the same direction we instinctively looked, far beyond the village. Water. A wall of black water, racing toward them. Someone screamed. Panic exploded instantly. Parents grabbed children. Men untied boats. Women ran toward cabins. The peaceful village dissolved into chaos within seconds. Dean whispered, "Oh God." The flood wasn't coming. It had already happened. We were standing inside its memory. People began shouting names. "Lucas! Mary! Get to the boats!" children cried. Dogs barked wildly. A church window shattered. Water crashed through the first row of cabins. Entire buildings splintered apart like toys. The current swallowed people before they could even scream. Boats overturned. Lanterns vanished beneath the black surge. The sound was overwhelming. Timber snapping, glass breaking, hundreds of voices calling for loved ones. Grace covered her ears. "I can't." Neither could I. Then I saw him, a younger Elias, 30 years old, wearing a yellow engineer's raincoat, standing on a hill overlooking the village, helpless, watching. His younger brother ran through waist-deep water carrying 2 children. He looked toward the hill, toward Elias. Even from that distance, I saw the expression on his face. Not anger, disappointment. He had believed his brother would come. He never did. Seconds later, the current took him. He vanished beneath the water. The children disappeared with him. The younger Elias collapsed to his knees, screaming, but no sound came from his mouth, only silence. Beside me, the old Elias fell to the ground. He watched himself from decades ago. "I should have gone." Nobody answered. "I could have reached them." His shoulders shook violently. "I was afraid." The admission echoed through the memory. The flood paused. Not literally, everything simply slowed. The creature appeared beside the younger Elias. No one else seemed able to see it. It whispered into his ear, then looked directly at the old man standing beside me. We waited. The flood surged forward again. The last remaining cabin disappeared beneath the black water. The church bell rang one final time. Then everything vanished. The village, the people, the screams, gone. We stood once more in the flooded swamp. Only the rushing water remained. Elias stared into the darkness for a long time. Then he whispered something none of us expected. "They're not trying to trap us anymore." Dean looked at him. "What are they trying to do?" The old guide slowly looked toward the heart of the swamp. "They want someone to tell the truth." At that exact moment, somewhere deep in the darkness ahead, a bright white searchlight swept across the trees. Someone else had entered Black Cypress Preserve, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. The beam cut through the swamp like a lighthouse, bright, white, real. For the first time since we'd entered Black Cypress Preserve, we saw something that belonged to the modern world. A high-powered LED spotlight. It swept across the cypress trunks before disappearing behind thick curtains of moss. Then it returned, closer this time. Dean actually laughed, a broken, exhausted laugh. "They found us." Grace didn't smile. "They can't be here." Dean rounded on her. "Why not?" "Because nobody knows where we are." The words settled over us. She was right. Every GPS had failed. Every radio transmission had been twisted. Every map had changed. No one should have been able to find us. The light flashed 3 times, a signal. Dean instinctively answered with his flashlight. 3 flashes back. For several seconds, nothing. Then a voice echoed through the swamp. "Marcus!" I froze, not because someone knew my name, because it wasn't my copy's voice. It sounded human, desperate. "Is anybody there?" Dean cupped his hands around his mouth. "Here!" The spotlight swung wildly before locking onto us. "There!" another voice shouted. "I see them!" Branches snapped somewhere ahead. Engines roared. Not 1, 3, airboats. Grace burst into tears. Within moments, the boats emerged from the darkness. Their massive fans threw spray high into the air as they skimmed across the flooded marsh. The lead boat carried 4 uniformed rangers. Behind them came 2 sheriff's deputies, 1 paramedic, another wildlife officer, 7 people, living, breathing, real. The lead ranger cut his engine. "You folks all right?" Dean nearly collapsed. "I've never been happier to see anybody." The ranger jumped onto what remained of the dock. Mid-40s, sunburned, state patch sewn onto his shoulder. Mud covered his boots. Every detail felt wonderfully ordinary. "My name's Carl Bennett." He looked each of us over. "You've been missing almost 48 hours. Dean frowned. "What?" The ranger blinked. "Your office reported you overdue yesterday." I looked at my watch. It still read Wednesday evening. The ranger noticed. He slowly answered the question before we asked it. "It's Friday." Nobody spoke. The paramedic approached Grace. "We're going to get you folks checked out." She stared at him. "What day?" "Friday." "What month?" He looked confused. "September." Grace slowly sat down. Dean whispered, "We lost 2 days." Elias hadn't moved. He remained staring into the flooded trees behind us. The ranger followed his gaze. "Sir?" No response. "Elias?" The old guide finally spoke. "They're watching." The ranger smiled politely. "Nobody's watching." I looked behind the rescue boats. Hundreds of cypress trees, fog drifting between them, nothing else. Then, just before I turned away, I saw them. Faces, dozens, standing between the trees, perfectly still, watching the rescue. None of the rangers reacted, only us. The paramedic began checking our pupils. Blood pressure, heart rate, routine questions, name, birthday, address. Everything felt wonderfully normal, until he reached Elias. "Full name, sir?" The old guide looked at him for a very long time. Finally, he quietly answered, "I don't have one anymore." The ride back should have taken an hour. Instead, we reached the boat launch in 23 minutes. Dean noticed first. "This isn't right." The ranger shrugged. "Water's unusually high." No, that wasn't it. The swamp looked smaller. Entire channels we'd spent days navigating were gone. The abandoned village wasn't there. The cemetery had vanished. Even the old ferry dock had disappeared. Nothing remained except endless trees and dark water. Had we imagined everything? I almost believed it. Until I looked down. Emma's dinosaur was still sitting in my jacket pocket. The landing was chaos. Police cruisers, ambulances, state wildlife trucks, news vans, and portable floodlights. People hurried in every direction. The moment our boats touched shore, Melissa ran toward me. She hit me so hard we both nearly fell into the mud. She sobbed into my shoulder. "I thought," her voice broke, "I thought you were dead." I held her tighter than I ever had. Behind her, Emma stood clutching another green dinosaur, the twin of the one in my pocket. She looked up at me. "Daddy," I dropped to one knee. She threw both arms around my neck. "I missed you so much," I cried, right there in front of everyone. I didn't care. For several hours, everything felt real again. Doctors examined us, deputies took statements, coffee appeared, dry clothes, blankets, questions, hundreds of questions. What happened? We got lost. How? We don't know. What about the missing survey equipment? We lost it. What about the village? Every official looked confused. What village? They spread old maps across a folding table. No logging settlement appeared anywhere. Not one. The ranger frowned. "There's never been a town in that section." Elias laughed, a hollow laugh. "That's what they kept saying." Later that afternoon, a historian from the county archives arrived. She listened quietly while Elias described Camp Cypress. When he finished, she became very still. Everyone turned toward her. A proposal. For what? A logging town. She shuffled through old documents. It was canceled before construction. Elias slowly shook his head. "No, they built it." She frowned. "There are no records." There wouldn't be. That evening, after hours of interviews, a deputy quietly pulled me aside. He handed me a weathered leather wallet. "We found this in your backpack." "It isn't mine." Inside lay an old black and white photograph, the same family photograph from the abandoned cabin. Elias's brother, his wife, 3 sons, only this time someone else stood in the background. Not the tall figure, not the creature. Us, Dean, Grace, Elias, and me, standing behind the family, watching them. The photograph was dated August 3rd, 1983, 39 years before any of us had entered the swamp. I looked up. The deputy was gone. No one had handed me the wallet. No one nearby even remembered speaking to me. That night, I lay awake in a motel room listening to traffic outside. Normal sounds, passing cars, distant sirens, air conditioners humming. Melissa and Emma slept peacefully in the other beds. I should have slept too. Instead, I kept staring at the ceiling. Around 3 in the morning, water began dripping somewhere inside the room. Drip, drip, drip. I got up. The bathroom faucet wasn't leaking. Neither was the sink. The sound came from the hallway. I opened the motel door. The carpet outside was dry. The dripping stopped. As I turned back toward my room, I noticed muddy footprints leading inside. Bare footprints. They hadn't been there a moment earlier. They crossed the carpet, past my sleeping family, and stopped beside Emma's bed. On her pillow rested the little green dinosaur, not the one she'd brought from home, the other one, the one my copy had carried into the swamp. Tucked beneath it was a folded piece of yellowed paper. With shaking hands, I opened it. There were only 6 words. Thank you for remembering our names. Beneath the message, someone had signed it, Camp Cypress. Not a person, the entire town. And when I looked back toward the window, for just a heartbeat, I saw hundreds of faint reflections standing outside in the darkness. Not watching anymore, just waiting for someone else to forget. 3 years passed before I ever spoke about Black Cypress. Not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, I knew they wouldn't. I stayed silent because I was afraid someone would. The official report blamed exhaustion, heat stress, flooding, disorientation. According to the state, our survey team had wandered off course after severe weather destroyed our navigation equipment. 2 days, that's all they admitted. 48 missing hours, nothing more. No abandoned village, no impossible photographs, no drowned community, no mention of Camp Cypress. Dean resigned 6 months later. He never entered another swamp. Grace transferred to an office position in Columbia and refused every field assignment afterward. She married a year later, and I've never seen her wear green again, not once. Elias never left Black Cypress. People assume he disappeared. That's what the newspapers printed. Local guide missing during follow-up investigation. The search lasted 11 days. Divers, dogs, helicopters, nothing. No body, no clothing, no shotgun, no trace. I wasn't surprised. Deep down, I think Elias finally kept the promise he'd broken 40 years earlier. He went back. For a long time, life felt almost normal. Melissa never asked me what really happened. I don't think she wanted to know. Emma eventually stopped talking about Daddy's swamp. Children forget strange things surprisingly quickly. Adults don't. I didn't sleep much after that. Whenever I closed my eyes, I dreamed of water. Not drowning, but black water stretching endlessly beneath moonlight. Sometimes I heard church bells, sometimes laughter, sometimes someone quietly calling my name from just beyond the reeds. I always woke before I answered. Always. Then, almost exactly 3 years later, my phone rang, unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer. A woman spoke, professional and calm. Mr. Marcus Hallen? Yes. My name is Rebecca Foster. I'm calling from the South Carolina Historical Preservation Office. Every hair on my arm stood up. We're conducting archival research on several communities displaced during reservoir construction in the early 1980s. I couldn't speak. We've uncovered references to a settlement called Camp Cypress. The room seemed to tilt. We found your name attached to an old survey report. My voice barely worked. How? There wasn't much. She hesitated. Actually, there was something strange. She explained that workers renovating an abandoned county courthouse had discovered a sealed records room behind a collapsed wall. Inside were hundreds of forgotten boxes. Most contained ordinary land deeds, construction permits, tax records. One crate held water-damaged engineering files. The final folder contained photographs, dozens of them, every resident of Camp Cypress, every family, every building, every church service, every school photograph, everything we'd seen inside the village. Except now, the tall figure in the background had disappeared, completely, as though it had never been there. Rebecca asked if I'd be willing to identify anyone. Against every instinct I had, I agreed. The archive occupied the basement of an old brick courthouse, climate-controlled, quiet. The smell of old paper filled every hallway. Rebecca greeted me warmly. She had no idea why my hands shook. She laid the photographs across a large table. I recognized every face. Every cabin, every child, even the little girl carrying the stuffed rabbit. I remembered her, not from a picture, but from the water. Then I noticed something else. Every photograph now had names written neatly on the back, complete family histories, birth dates, occupations, church memberships. Someone had identified every single resident. Someone had finally remembered them. I smiled for the first time in years. Maybe that was enough. Maybe they could finally rest. Rebecca slid one final envelope across the table. This one puzzles us. Inside was an aerial photograph taken during construction of the reservoir. The date printed beneath it read, August 17, 1983. The image showed the valley before flooding. Camp Cypress stood clearly visible. The church, the school, the cabins, everything. No official map had ever acknowledged it, yet there it was, undeniable, real. My eyes drifted toward the lower right corner. A survey crew stood near the shoreline. 4 people, too small to identify. Rebecca smiled. Funny coincidence. What? They're wearing modern safety vests. Every muscle in my body locked. Modern reflective orange vests, hard hats with state logos that didn't exist until decades later. Our equipment, our uniforms, us, standing in 1983, watching the flood before it happened. I left the archive without another word. Halfway across the parking lot, I realized someone had slipped a folded page into my jacket pocket. Not Rebecca, not security. I unfolded it. Yellow paper, old, water stained. It was a page torn from the Camp Cypress church register. Across the bottom, written in fresh black ink, was a new entry. Visitors: Marcus Hallen, Dean Holloway, Grace Benoit, Elias Thibodeau. Below our names, a final line had appeared. The ink still glistened. Account settled. I looked back toward the courthouse. Every window reflected afternoon sunlight, except one. The basement archive, standing behind the glass, were dozens of people, all smiling. Not the unnatural smiles from the swamp, real ones, grateful ones. Then they slowly stepped away from the window, one by one, until only a little girl remained. She raised one hand and waved, then disappeared into the darkness. I haven't dreamed about Black Cypress since that day. The church bells stopped, the whispers stopped, the footsteps outside my house stopped. Emma's dinosaur hasn't moved again. Sometimes I think they found peace. Sometimes I think they simply found someone else to remember them. Last month I drove past the reservoir for the first time since everything happened. I didn't stop, I didn't even slow down. But as I crossed the bridge, I glanced toward the black water. Just once. The lake was perfectly calm. Beautiful. Families were fishing. Children laughed from pontoon boats. People waved as they passed each other. A completely ordinary Saturday. Then the afternoon sun struck the surface at just the right angle. For less than a second, I saw it beneath the water. An entire town. Church steeple, boardwalks, cabins, lanterns glowing softly in windows, exactly as it had been before the flood. Then a passing boat disturbed the surface. The vision vanished. People ask me now if I still believe in ghosts. I tell them no. Ghosts are supposed to be dead. Some places don't let people become ghosts. Some places remember them too well. And if you ever find yourself deep in a southern swamp, where the water is black enough to reflect stars that aren't in the sky, and you hear a church bell ringing where no church should exist, don't answer the voices. Don't follow the lanterns. And if someone you love calls your name from somewhere out in the reeds, keep walking, because the swamp doesn't hate you. It doesn't even want to kill you. It only wants one thing, and that is to make sure that no one is ever forgotten.